Hey, my name is Chris Brennan. You're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Joining me today is astrologer Pallas K. Augustine, and we're going to be talking about the floating IC as a sensitive point and what happens when it falls in different whole sign houses in the chart besides the fourth whole sign house, and how it imports fourth house or IC significations, which then double up in the whole sign house that it falls in. So, hey, Pallas, thanks for joining me.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you on the show. This is your first time on the show, and we've been talking
Mhm.
about doing this for over a year now because you recently just published a book on the IC itself, right?
In 2022, when Jupiter in Pisces was conjunct my IC, we launched a Kickstarter to fund the IC and Astrology of Coming Home. It was wildly successful, which was beautiful. I love my Kickstarter backers. And it took us a couple years to get it all together. Hugh Tran, a brilliant designer and astrologer, did the whole book too. And so it took us a couple years, but we got it. It was beautiful. And then the first run after we fulfilled the Kickstarter backers orders sold out immediately. So it took us a while to come out with a second edition. But now we have a second edition of the IC. It's an ebook and a print book, and it's available. So I am talking about it more. And it was wonderful to get your invitation to talk about this topic here because it's one I think and talk about a lot.
Yeah, definitely. And it was funny last year when we started talking about this because your book was coming out right as I was releasing or about to release my
Mhm.
deep dive into the fourth house in astrology. And I thought about doing one on the IC with you, but I wanted to finish the fifth house first because that's the other house where for a lot of people, the IC, the floating IC will either fall in the fourth whole sign house or the third whole sign house or the fifth whole sign house. And once I recently finally did the fifth house episode, which I've episodes that I've just released over the course of the past few weeks, I finished sort of collecting a lot of example charts for those placements and feel like I have a much clearer picture now about that placement, even though I've understood it for almost like 20 years now that I've been working with this concept of the IC as a floating point. Having demonstrated it, I feel good about now being able to have this discussion and talk about it more comprehensively, especially because one of the things that you did is we put out a survey over the past week asking for people for examples, and we actually got a lot of great submissions, right?
So many. Yeah, we got 245 over the course of just a couple days. And people were so vulnerable and sweet and honest. And I just want to extend a lot of gratitude to everyone who submitted. We can only talk about a handful today, but my research into this is ongoing. The IC book itself has 16 like in-depth client case stories about ICs and different signs, and then chart rulers in different whole sign houses as well. And so this work is just very near and dear to my heart, and it really touches me that people wanted to share, and we'll share a few of them today.
Brilliant. All right. Well, the majority of this episode will be us going through those submissions and talking about them. I'll mention or reiterate a few of the examples that I found during the course of doing the houses series over the past year. But the main focus will be on sharing those chart examples that were submitted by listeners over the course of the past week. And then, of course, people can get a hold of your book. Right now, you're selling it exclusively through your website, right?
Through idolastellarum.com. There's a shop there, and you can get the print and the ebook versions.
Cool. All right. I'll put the link to that in the description below this video on YouTube or on the podcast website entry for this episode. All right. So why don't we set a foundation first for everything in IC language by talking about the IC and talking about the fourth house and talking about this concept that originally, like 20 years ago, when I first came into astrology, and like, I mean, ironically, like many people, I heard about the concept of whole sign houses coming in as a Placidus, like modern astrology user, and I was like, that's not a good system. Like what that doesn't make any sense that the IC doesn't start with the degree of the fourth house doesn't start with the degree of the IC. And I actually rejected the idea of whole sign houses for like the first year after I heard from it. It wasn't until I learned all of Hellenistic astrology and I learned the whole system and how the system works together that I started to understand that perspective better. And now it's been 20 years, literally 20 years of me reviving that and using that idea that the degree of the IC can float around the bottom part of the chart as a sensitive point and import functionally like IC or fourth house significations into whatever fourth whole sign house it falls. But a lot of this comes back to the symbolism of what the IC and the fourth house represent. And you are the resident expert in that. So where do we start with that discussion?
Oh, there's so many places to start. I just did a talk for the Washington State Astrological Association, and in that one, we used the concept of mycorrhizal fungi, who are basically the mycelium in the soil, who have a symbiotic relationship with the plants that grow in the soil. And it's a huge network, and it's how so many discoveries are being made about this kind of this fungal network, this mycelium, facilitating not only plant communication but also plant health. It acts almost as an immune system, and to me, the IC is so similar to that. And of course, it's sort of funny to talk about the IC out of relationship with the midheavens since they're intertwined. They're the same axis, right? They
Mhm.
float together around the chart. And so to me, the midheaven are these, what gets planted, right? Like what blooms from the IC and the like mycelium that are down there. And it's a very common to talk about the IC through the metaphor of roots. And it is that for sure, both in the familial sense and also in the land sense. And of course, these are where we see the fourth house topics start to come out. But it's even more than that. Like in my research, time and time again, the IC connected people into not only their lineages of family and home, but also their lineages of culture and craft and vocation and place and art, right? And so when we start playing with, when we kind of liberate the IC and the midheaven from being only associated with the fourth and 10th, we start seeing, and if we work with clients, of course, I'm a consulting astrologer, all my work and research comes from my client research. It just opens up the possibilities for what people are able to see when they look at their IC. And so many people have such complicated relationships with their families that approaching the IC with this more open interpretation, which using it within a whole sign house system allows us to do, it's so much more generative for people as they look at their lives, they look at their lived experiences, and they try to track these stories. And the IC, the depths that are available there, I've seen it do just even a slight awareness, right? Like connecting into it, thinking about it, kind of returning it to its place in the chart as the foundation of the chart, really allowing people to honestly like gain like more confidence in their life and more understanding of their place. And when we work in a kind of even remotely deterministic model, we kind of need that to be able to understand like what we're doing here, right? And who we're connected with. And the IC is the strongest place that I've found that really connects people into that.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And I like what you said there. One of the things that you mentioned that's interesting is like sometimes people have the perception that whole sign houses is more simplistic and less complex when you're not working with all of these intermediate cusps that are floating around. But ironically, when it comes to the IC floating around the bottom half of the chart and the MC floating around the top half, and then blending significations functionally of like two different like houses or domains or like ranges of significations together, it actually creates a much more complex and specific complex and specific range of significations than you might expect. So there's actually a greater complexity to that approach that I think until you've had some experience working with it and talking with clients that have the IC in different houses that might be unexpected if you're not familiar with that approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things too, and we're not doing any fourth house IC examples today, since you covered much of that in your fourth house series, but there's a way that it actually allowing the IC, even if people are working in quadrant houses, allowing the whole sign counted from the ascendant to be part of the delineation of the midheaven and IC is a really powerful tool in this way. And it actually makes it more specific and special when the IC does fall in the fourth whole sign house, when it's not just given. So it's sort of part of like my pet theory about the whole thing in terms of connecting the work that, we did in the book and the work that I do with clients into like the traditions that we're working within is that it's possible that the IC has taken on a lot of the fourth house significations because of its association with the fourth house cusp and quadrant systems, right? But it doesn't, that's not necessarily inherent. And certainly in many of the stories that we see, it's not an inherent connection to that familial rooting. And it's often when it's in a different house than the fourth, there's often an absence of that kind of familial rooting or land or real estate or these kind of fourth house topics, or those topics have we're able to reckon with fourth house topics in a way that we would reckon with any house topics, right? Rather than just immediately assuming that these are people's foundations that support their life and support their midheaven contributions.
Okay, yeah. Well, let's talk about that because that's something for me, it's like there's two ways to go about researching this and approaching it. On the one hand, and two ways that you really see it come up in practice. And one of those is just by looking at natal charts and looking at examples of charts where you have the fourth whole sign house, and then you have the IC when it falls in usually either like, let's say, the fifth house or the third whole sign house. And that's one way of like approaching researching this topic. And then the second way of approaching researching it is the same thing, but instead looking at the sequence of what happens with the transits. So, for example, let's say the IC is in the fifth whole sign house. That means, for example, a person will get a Saturn transit that'll go through their fourth whole sign house for 2 or 3 years. And then immediately following that, they'll get a Saturn transit that will go through their fifth whole sign house, but it will also pass over their IC. And one of the things I've always shown is how you'll see a continuation of, for lack of a better word, like fourth house topics that go across the fourth whole sign house and the fifth whole sign house because of the presence of the IC extending some of those fourth house significations into the next sign. And that's one of the best ways to test this and show and see for yourself that it really does work, especially when you experience a transit like that. But for me, as a result of that, I don't make a lot of symbolic distinction between, or I see a lot of overlap between the fourth whole sign house having similar fourth house significations and the IC having or importing similar fourth house significations. Do you see it the same, or do you see it differently than how I've stated it there?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, it happens with perfections as well, where you'll have a fourth house year, and that will bring in the rulers, significations of that. And then if you have your IC in the fifth, when you move into that house year, you're going to have IC activations as well. And there's a piece there where it's, I mean, this is part of the fun and this is part of the research, right? Of figuring
Mm,
out, and especially when you're talking to clients and doing this work with clients and bringing this in, or you come across an IC activation and it's in a different, if it's in the third or it's in the fifth, and being able to help them parse apart like what is the fourth house versus what is the IC and what assumptions have we brought into that
mm,
and how does our IC function in relationship with our fourth house no matter where the IC is because
mhm.
that's a huge issue and that comes out in many of the examples, right? It's like people we actually, one of the funny things about the submissions is that I had to dig and dig and dig to find an IC ruler in the fourth house example.
Mm,
And the one that I did find, it's someone who just doesn't get it, just doesn't see the difference because fourth house stuff for them is like really crappy, and their IC is in Taurus, and it should be like a little bit better, but they're icy rulers in Aries, and so they're wrapped up together in this weird way. But
mm,
if you kind of pull it out, you look at the fifth house significations, you look at the exaltation ruler of the IC as well as the domicile ruler. This is such a potent piece of the puzzle.
mm,
And then you see that the house gets pulled in, and Pisces gets pulled in, and their ascendant does, and there's this whole story that their fourth house is kind of literally hot and painful to the touch, right? But when you pull out the IC and you reckon with it alongside fourth house stuff, when you're like, okay, this is painful, this is literally part of your IC signature that fourth house stuff is painful, right?
mm.
And then it just opens it up so you can find connections in all the other ways and the ways that the houses relate together through their chart, through their rulers. And yeah, it's juicy.
Yeah, totally. Um, so let's before we get into the examples, maybe let's give some significations and some meanings of the fourth house and the IC in order to ground the basic and most fundamental symbolic meanings of those things in astrology, and therefore what sort of things we would expect to find if this technique works, once we start seeing the IC importing those significations into different whole sign houses. So, what are some of our primary topics? I mean, for me, it's primarily like the parents traditionally and themes of family, and then secondarily the home and the living situation, and also finally like the private life, because the fourth is opposite to the 10th, which is the most visible and public part of the chart. So the fourth is like the most hidden part of the chart, and symbolically it's also the place that is under the earth, but below our feet from our perspective astronomically. So a lot of the significations come from there.
Hmm. Yeah, the if you when you're thinking about the geometry of it, there's the IC, and then there's the point that's square, the ascendant descendant is always going to be in the fourth and the 10th, and I think that that's like a really helpful way to sort of think about it. The question that we asked in our survey, this is considering the IC as our home, parents, roots, tethers, ancestors, source, familial stories, and experiences. How do you see the IC importing those topics into the whole sign house that it falls in your chart? And are there any significant overlaps? And I feel like that's like for a lot of people, their kind of their roots and their tethers and this sort of supportive mycelium soil is in their biological family lineages, or adoptive, of course, but the family lineages of the fourth house. But sometimes the family that ends up being important, that ends up being like the actual nourishing, connective force in their life, is not their bio family, right? It is not the people they grew up with. Often with fifth house topics, and so this is just sort of expanding the keywords that we might think about, right? Is like chosen family comes up so much when it comes to
Mm,
fifth house ICs, and ancestors of culture, say, right? So if someone is an artist, say they're a dancer, the lineage of dancers before them ends up being really important to their life. And third house, it's the siblings is certainly a huge one that constantly comes up, but those siblings take on take on that like familial fourth housey kind of root system, right? So many of the third house examples that we received are third house IC examples that we received are people who in some way were parentified, right? Like they became a parent, or there was one of their siblings kind of became their parent while they were growing up. And that's very common for that third house IC topic. And also that one thing that really comes up, and I think this has to do with the fact that throughout history, our places of worship, like where we gathered together to worship and experience devotion and togetherness in that way, religion and spirituality were in our neighborhood, right? Like we went to the church because the church was within walking distance for the kids, right? And
Mm,
I think the third house, so often in third house ICs especially, people end up connecting to that familial root system sort of that we associate with the fourth house, that is a fourth house topic, ends up in part being within their religious traditions and within their spiritual connections. And that's also something that when we kind of expand out these keywords, they are like those things can be fourth house too if they overlap, right?
mm.
And then they're also they are so just IC stuff because that can the way that it moves through is it really adds to our grab bag of topics.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. So and then I know we're going to go through each houses, so maybe we'll present a synthesis of significations at the top of each house, but I just want to make sure we're really clear about so our primary significations for the IC in this episode is we're talking about home, parents, roots, tethers, ancestors, source, familial stories and experiences, and then I would add just like the private life. And actually, I need to add a couple other ones for that really came up in the fourth house one, which is sometimes matters surrounding the end of life or even death and mortality can come up in the fourth slash IC more often than you might think, like endings. And then the final one was what was the final one? I guess it's just yeah, that idea of that which is not just private, but also ideas of that which is hidden or even ideas of secrecy can come up because it is that lowest, most hidden part of the chart that's under the feet astronomically and therefore not visible. So sometimes it's that which is behind the scenes and not visible, even though it's sometimes playing a very important role in managing things.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely the hiddenness is, I mean, we literally, you can't see the IC. And I mean, I had a Christina Mantinen, who is a practicing astrologer in Finland, who's practiced for 40 years. She pointed out to me while we were doing this research that in certain very, very northern places in Scandinavia, or basically places that are circumpolar, the IC can actually go above the horizon because it is those days that the midsummer or the solstice days where the sun doesn't even go above the horizon or doesn't set, right? And so there's these
Right.
really extreme moments where even when it's above the horizon, it's still not visible because the horizon is not visible at those moments in the
Mm,
sky that we're actually looking at. And so I think understanding the IC as this place, I often talk about it like you can't actually even really look at it. And this is part of why, there's not that much in the literature on it. There's not that much, being done on it is because you kind of have to, it's kind of like feeling around in the dark and seeing what you bump up against, right? Rather than being able to, so as much as like the technique it gives us these magical, mysterious ways to be able to access the IC like we're doing today, right? In order to understand these narratives. At the same time, the IC itself is this place of mystery. It is this place of secrets, and it's often things that I say in the book, it's like that's partially like, there's some demons down there. I mean, there's demons everywhere in the chart, but there's like, some rough ones down there, and a lot of people are kind of scared to look down there, which and sometimes for good reason, but oftentimes those stories that come with the IC, those really scary ones, like they're also protective, right? In this sort of mycelium immune system kind of way that supports our whole being and all the experiences we go through.
right. Yeah, for sure. There was I remember in the big fourth house episode we did last year, there was one story of a famous person who was trans, but they were a musician and they wanted to play in musician circles, so they had to pass as a man, and they grew up their entire life essentially like trying to passing as a man, and then when they passed away, their family discovered they were trans, which was a surprise and made a media sensation at the time. But they had a lot of stuff going on in their fourth house. And so it was a really tangible example of that idea of secrets or that which is hidden sometimes being really important in a person's life because sometimes in that instance, there was like, wanting to achieve their career dreams and their passion for music. And only one way to do that was to keep that like a part of themselves secret, for example, and to hide that because they otherwise could either not be able to pursue their passion and their dreams or otherwise could face dangers, like actual like threats to their life. So that was a really stunning example I remember in the fourth house episode that impressed on me sometimes the importance of the hidden aspect of things occasionally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it can be literally scary down there for sure. And the fourth house itself can carry so much power. I mean, being the end of the matter, right? Being the end of life, and also um, the even just the association with real estate is, that in this world is associated with private property. And when we're in a homelessness crisis, right, and a housing crisis and scarcity, it's the fourth house becomes a really loaded place in many, many people's charts. And the IC takes on quite a bit of that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Are there any other fourth house things that we should summarize as just really important meanings that you got to or focused on, especially in the book, before we jump into the chart examples and start going through the houses?
I think that covers most of it, especially when we start getting into the examples and we start seeing how these things play out through people's lives.
Okay, excellent. All right. So how are we going to do this? We're going to go through, you want to go through the smaller houses first, or do you want to go through that's the route?
Yeah, so I think maybe a little bit of like astronomical context might be helpful. So it is possible for the IC to be, it's most often in the third, fourth, or fifth house. And sometimes it's in the second or the sixth, although those only happen at extreme latitudes and they're quite rare. So I just have a couple examples from each of those from the people who wrote in. And I think they can kind of go together as being these sort of extreme outliers that we can see. And we can kind of see that a little bit in their stories. And then we can move on to sort of a more robust discussion of the much more common third house and fifth house.
Okay. So I
So,
like that idea of showing astronomically. Let me show a chart really quickly for like
yeah.
the moment to demonstrate that. So here is the chart. I'll back it up for now here in Denver for when we started with late Sagittarius rising. This is our election today. And so let's say this chart, for example, Sagittarius is rising, like late Sagittarius is rising, which means Sagittarius is the first whole sign house. Capricorn, therefore, because it's the second sign, is the second whole sign house. Aquarius is the third house, and Pisces is the fourth whole sign house. So most of our fourth house significations are showing up there in Pisces in the entirety of that sign from 0 to 30 degrees. But one of the unique things about whole sign houses is we find the degree of the IC in this instance over at 21 degrees of Aries. So it's in the fifth whole sign house. And therefore, according to the theory of the technique, we would see an importing of, let's say, fourth house significations into the fifth whole sign house where there's a doubling up. And one of the things that's interesting and unique about the whole sign perspective is it doesn't just start at the IC, even though the IC is going to definitely be the most sensitive point where there would be a culmination of fourth house significations, but really the fourth house significations that are being imported from the IC start at the beginning of the sign and last until the end of the sign. So that's a really important conceptual thing we need to
Mhm.
convey that in this approach, the IC acts as a sensitive point in the same way that the lot of fortune or the ascendant act as sensitive points, which is to say that they are sensitive points that mark or designate the entirety of the sign that they fall in with their significations. So that's how, for example, the lot of fortune was used in ancient astrology, where whatever sign it falls in, that entire sign gets marked with lot of fortune significations, or the degree of the ascendant, because it falls in 28 degrees of Sagittarius in this chart. It marks the entirety of Sagittarius with first house significations, all the way from 0 degrees of Sagittarius to the last degree. So that's an important part of the conceptual model that is good to convey at this stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about the way transits work to it as well, like thinking about the IC as this culmination point, right? And so when we're working at it with transits, it's like the whole sign of approach activates the IC in a way, and then
Mm,
of course fades out as it moves through the rest of the sign. But that's a really thinking about them as these sensitive points because it is kind of a node, right? Like it is a place where the ecliptic and the meridian contact each other. And of course, the midheaven is the one we can see, and in this chart, it's in the 11th house. And so having with Venus right there, so sweet. I've loved these charts. Um,
yeah, this is our
and
election today.
yeah, and so of course there's a lot of ways that people kind of shorthand define the midheaven and IC, right? And they're not necessarily the most astronomically accurate, but as like the midheaven being, say, like the highest point in the sky, like that's kind of true, but depending on what time of day you're looking at, it's not necessarily the highest the midheaven is going to get in that day because it's the way it's like the ecliptic moves. Well, we move, of course, but the ecliptic goes, it looks like it moves from east to west as the sun moves around. And then the meridian is what is just our north-south line. Straight. So here for me, it's like this is south. And so we have this north-south line. And wherever they meet, and of course this changes unless we're in the equator, this changes connected to what season of the year we're in. And so the midheaven rises and lowers in itself and moves through the sky. And so you can see it's always that southern point, but with the ecliptic moving, we see when we move the chart forward, the midheaven also moves through the zodiac.
Right. And that's a really important point. I'll animate it in just a second, but that this is where the crux of the issue, and this is the issue that has to be resolved, that we've been working on over the past 20 years, and have been taking steps to articulate better. But the issue, as you just pointed out, is like the meridian, which is what we call, let's say, the degree of the MC, which is the floating point that we'll be talking about, is like the north-south line, basically. Like the meridian points to where north is, basically. And the planets reach their highest elevation at the degree of the MC. So there's some sense of reaching the highest point of something with the degree of the MC, and also some notion of it being associated with north and the north-south axis. However, the 90-degree point, once you find the degree of the ascendant, which is the eastern horizon, the point that's exactly 90 degrees from that, which in this chart, since 28 degrees of Sagittarius is rising, that means 28 degrees of Virgo would be the 90-degree point. That's actually the 90-degree point if you're like standing on the earth and you look directly overhead. That's actually what you would find. And the fixed stars, for example, around that point are what you would see if you look directly upwards. And the ancient Mesopotamian astrologers would use those 90-degree point stars in order to tell time at night. So there's this secondary similar overlap of meaning of like the stars that are at the top of the sky, or the part of the sky that is directly above your head. And that's the fundamental symbolic and conceptual. You could either frame it as a conflict here, where we have two separate points that are representing similar overlapping significations of like 10th house midheaven significations. Or you could say, if it's not a conflict, you could say that there's a 2 points in the sky fundamentally that have similar and complementary and overlapping meanings, and therefore it's not just one thing or the other, which is the trap that astrologers want to fall into. And it's why
Oh,
some of
yeah.
the house division debates get so intense because each astrologer that just adopts one approach, like if you're just adopting the like quadrant house systems, the midheaven very obviously, symbolically, and in chart work does represent 10th house things. And that is a experience that is very obvious and strongly felt because astronomically and symbolically it does have some of those notions of culmination and highest elevation of planets and things like that. But then people that work with whole sign also see that the 10th whole sign house, the zodiacal sign that was culminating at the moment of birth, also shares and carries these 10th house highest point, most public and visible point significations as well. And so part of the goal here and what you and I are doing today is we're showing one of the best ways that we've found to reconcile that, which is taking into account both and recognizing it's not an either or situation, but in fact, both are true at the same time. And what's, sorry, one last thing to before that approach is not something we're just inventing, but this approach is actually something Vedius Valens talked about in the second
Yes.
century and outlined. And that's why for 20 years now, I've been using this approach in the first place, because when I read the full anthology back in 2005, Valens has this chapter in like book five of the anthology where he starts talking about exactly this approach and outlining this notion of the degree of the MC importing 10th house significations and doubling up into whatever whole sign house it falls. So already in Valens, he's reconciling these two different frameworks and he's showing you the path forward to using both by recognizing that they both share similar significations and can be used together rather than something that's in competition. And there's something really beautiful and elegant about that.
Totally. Yeah, I'm very much a secret third thing coded person in basically every aspect of my life, including
Right.
my astrological techniques. And actually my natal chart, which we're not going to share today, but it is this problem because my sun is actually square my ascendant descendant, but my actual midheaven is in the far other side of the sign. So in quadrant house systems, I'm firmly a ninth house sun, but anyone who knows me, like there's 10th house equalities to my Virgo sun, like absolutely. And that square to the ascendant descendant is this exactly. It has there's so much going on with it. And I think squares to the midheaven IC, of course, are that same thing if we take it from the north-south axis. And of course, for anyone who wants to understand more of the astronomy, I highly recommend going on YouTube and looking up astronomy lectures on the celestial sphere, and that will explain this meridian, the celestial equator stuff, all this stuff. And of course,
Mm.
this changes whether you're in the northern and southern hemisphere as well, but the midheaven IC is always that northern southern thing, no matter like whether you're in the northern or southern hemisphere, it just changes what it looks like. And I think there's something really potent about being able to um, understand squares to the angles as just as active points as the angles themselves. And of course, this is square to the midheaven I see is the vertex anti-vertex, which I don't work a lot in that frame in my practice, but squares to the midheaven I see are a very classically slept on function, I think, when people are looking at their transits and their perfections and any other timing technique that activates the zodiac, basically. So I think that doing what we're doing here, yeah, it really brings out how those techniques really do function. Like it's almost always the secret third thing when you're actually talking to people and working with people's lives, and I really value that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that takes some there's a learning curve to get like used to that and getting used to being
Totally.
able to comfortable working with that sort of ambiguity sometimes. But once you do, And once you truly unlock it, it just allows for all of this complexity and this nuance to come out, and you start seeing the shades of gray and the in-betweens and things like that. And it just creates such a richer backdrop for doing chart
Hmm.
delineations. So one last thing
Yeah.
I'll
Oh, yeah.
mention. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, for people who aren't more familiar with my work, it's like I sort of have this simultaneous education in like traditional Hellenistic revival as well as more psychological and archetypal lineages as well. And so even though when you're talking to me, I basically base all my delineations on whole sign houses, I'm usually actually looking at a Placidus chart when I'm looking at a chart in a consultation session because I love seeing the angles as they are because I understand it to be like representative of the actual sky and the horizon, right? But I'm blending these understandings of the whole sign houses, of the squares to the angles, of understanding the midheaven and IC as these floating important points. And I think that I don't know, there's just a very generative way to think about that. It's very Mercurial Jupiterian, which I definitely am, but yeah, it's delicious, honestly, when it comes to astrology.
Yeah, I actually think that's one of the ways. It's one of the reasons that it's harder to study the history of whole sign houses and when whole sign houses fell out of usage, because I think a
Mm.
lot of the astrologers from the medieval and Renaissance periods were like you in that they would cast a quadrant chart to have the quadrant house positions, but like they would just obviously implicitly be able to understand what the whole sign positions were at the same time
Yeah.
because you just count the signs. And so sometimes when you go back and look and people are like, well, we don't see a whole sign chart in such and such author, it's because
Mm.
like it's such a simple and like basic concept. But like sometimes it makes more sense to cast a quadrant chart and then just to infer the secondary positions on top of that.
Yeah, I think counting signs from the ascendant is also a skill that especially beginner astrologers should definitely get in the habit of because it once you do that, you can do derivative houses, you can do fortune houses like very easily just all in your head. And that's one of the sort of pet beginner techniques that I think. And basically when you do that, you're using whole sign houses no matter what kind
Mm.
of chart you're looking at. Um, and yeah, I think that's totally accurate in terms of this used to just be normal. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and there's like one chart example where like Marinus does that, and he talks about it, and it gives you
Mm.
a peek that sometimes like that approach persisted much longer into the tradition. That's in like the 17th century than you might expect. So there was one last point to make about that. What I wanted to state was I think part of what we're talking about here, I always come back to and have been developing over the past 10 years is what I call the mercurial nature of astrology, which is that, astrology was always traditionally represented by Mercury. And part of that is that astrologers are acting as interpreters and translators of the language of the stars and the sky. But also, there's a very practical reason for that I see come up over and over again in astrology, which is that we often run into these dilemmas in astrology that seem like dilemmas where we have two different, majorly seemingly competing ways of doing some specific technical thing where you almost, it seems like an either or situation, and astrologers sometimes come down really hard in picking one approach or the other. But so oftentimes I think the answer to this is just going back to realizing that astrology is a mercurial or mercury based thing. And with Mercury, it's whenever you have those things, it's not necessarily either or, but it's both. And so we see that sometimes with like, tropical versus sidereal or whole sign versus quadrant houses, or there can be like major aspects versus minor aspects or what have you. It just comes up over and over again, these seemingly contrasting things where it's like, how can two things be true at once? And so people aren't used to thinking like that because it's not our normal way, not everyone's normal way of thinking. But it's something I think that's really valuable and important for astrologers to get used to thinking because it is inherent to the very nature of astrology.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm definitely in the astrology as divination school and being an astrologer as being a diviner, and that it's more than translation. Like, yes, it is translation, but it's more than translation. And that so often every translator knows that there's a million ways to translate something, right? And it depends on, of course, the context. And when we're working with clients, it depends on their lived experience and what they're working with. And this is, yeah, music to my ears for sure.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Let's jump into it. Let's get into this.
Yeah.
We're gonna start. You want to start with the second house, right?
Hmm.
Oh yeah. Did I mention? I'll get to that later. But let's start with the second house. And so second house significations for me are things like money, possessions, material things associated with the person's life, like wealth and other things like that. Are there any other second house significations you usually throw in?
Yeah, I think I take a pretty expansive idea of resources,
Mm,
which of course is material wealth and income kind of, and there's a being in the second house, that below the horizon, next to the first. There is this idea of agency when it comes to those things versus the eighth, which is so similar, but that's like other people's agency when it comes to material wealth and things. So I do see things about the body and land coming up in second house too, even though those might be things we give to the first or the fourth. Those can come up, and I think especially in the culture we're living in, where that's tends to be so optimized and so productivity oriented. The idea of material wealth and income is often tied into one's body and one's health. And so those things can come up when we're talking to people as well when it comes to second house topics.
got it. All right. So let's share our first chart example, which is by a listener or
Hmm.
somebody that filled out the form named Johanna, right?
Yeah, Johanna lives in Helsinki, Finland. So, Johanna's the person who actually alerted me to the fact that it's actually quite common up there, right? Where up, right, in these extreme latitudes, for people to have their IC in the first house as well. So we ended up adding that as an option. We didn't get any examples, but she showed me a couple, and that she just knows on her own. And Johanna's chart is, I love it. It was if you put this date and time into Stellarium software to see the actual sky,
Hmm.
you can see how the sun and the Uranus are in relationship to each other at the sort of like highest point in the sky. If anyone wants to be a real nerd and go all the way for it. So I'm actually just going to read what Johanna wrote because I think it's so indicative. I guess we could go through what we're looking at here as well, right? So we have this
Yeah.
Cancer
Just
IC
so yeah,
and
just for the audio listeners. So
mhm.
Gemini rising, Cancer, I see.
Yeah, and Johanna has a moon in Sag right below the descendant, and then a separating from a square from Saturn and Pisces in the 10th, which also feels kind of relevant. The ascendant ruler for her Gemini ascendant is a stationary Mercury in Aquarius, conjunct Mars in the ninth, which also feels relevant to her story.
Okay.
So, um, so Johanna shares, I was born in 1994 into a family in the midst of a major recession in Finland, which was caused by the collapse of the Soviet Union and earlier financial market liberalization and foreign currency loans. A large number of Finns became heavily over-indebted and lost all their assets. My family was one of them, as my grandparents were merchants and my aunt's husband was an entrepreneur. My relatives lost practically all their property during the recession, and some of them were still repaying debts well into the 2020s. So, of course, with the IC in the second house, this puts the midheaven in the eighth house. So, would be a generational signature that people with this Uranus Neptune in Capricorn of her generation being living in Finland at this time would be living with. Um, from a young age, I had a feeling that I could be the one to get an education, become wealthy, and pay off my family's debts, even though as a child I didn't understand any of it. I've never received any money from my parents, but I've always been generous and tried to help my over-indebted relatives throughout my life. I started doing occasional jobs at the age of 13 to build up my own assets, and later I went on to study economics to better understand the causes of the 1990s recession and the mistakes made in handling it. Of course, I also thought that if I became an economist, I could get a well-paying job. I've always been interested in Finnish history, especially my family's history. Because we had no property, we also had no history. Our family's farms, houses, and cottages had been repossessed. And so here I think we can see another piece around that, looking at the fourth house as distinct from the second here.
Mhm.
So the fourth house is Virgo, and so sharing her ascendant ruler is also that Mercury with Mars in the ninth in Aquarius.
Right.
Um, as a
And
child,
she
yeah.
is motivated by her family situation to like go to
Hmm.
school and study economics, which is like a ninth house thing.
Yeah, and then also seeing that being that eighth house midheaven being ruled by that Saturn in Pisces in the 10th
Mm,
and had being in that square to that moon, which is her IC ruler.
right. Yeah, that makes sense. But the focal point is just have with the IC,
Yeah.
which is importing home and family significations into the
Hmm.
second whole sign house of money and
Yeah.
finances. That was a major like foundational thing early in her life was the unstable family financial situation.
And this thing that completely, it wasn't just family financial struggles, right? It completely uprooted not only her national identity, which is also something that we often associate with the fourth, right? But
Mm,
so bringing that into that second house and really just like entangling them completely together so that it impacted her entire life. She also shares a cute note here too, speaking to her moon. So her spouse's sun and Mercury is in Cancer exactly on her IC, which is
nice.
so cute. Um, and there's one piece I want to pull out from her story as well. And one thing that's funny, part of the reason she submitted is because, of course, my name Pallas, there's a national park wildlife reserve in Lapland in Finland called Pallas Tunturi, which is an essential part of her story and is part of why she's an example here because it's just so beautiful. So when we're thinking about the IC as a sensitive point, I feel like this is maybe the only example we have here of a transit or a lunation, eclipses especially, but lunations as well, activating the point of the IC and making really wild things happen. So um, she writes, in 2023, the new moon in Cancer aligned exactly with my IC. At the time, I was living with my partner, of course, this moon ruler of the IC in the seventh, in a rented apartment in Helsinki on the verge of burnout because I couldn't finish my university thesis after transitioning into full-time work. More second house stuff. Due to the war in Ukraine, interest rates rose significantly in Finland, and many private real estate investors were forced to sell their investment properties. That happened to us at the end of 2022, and shortly after the new moon in August 2023. Um, oh, yeah, the new moon in August 2023. Our landlord, right, more eighth house stuff, informed us that we had to move out because he was selling the apartment. We decided to move to Lapland and work remotely from there for a year. I wanted to reconnect with my roots as my grandparents were originally from Lapland, and the moon happened right around the full moon in Cancer, up before Christmas. In Lapland, I found my extended family with whom contact had been lost and discovered that my grandfather's childhood home from 1909 was still standing. This is extremely rare as Nazi Germany burned down almost all buildings in Finnish Lapland during World War II, making the house a valuable part of our cultural heritage. Living in the middle of the Palestinian Fells for a year helped me recover from burnout, and I found a sense of home. Located about 250 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, Palestinian offered a truly wonderful experience. Surrounded by the serene silence of Arctic nature, the untouched wilderness, northern lights, and crisp mountain air, I felt deeply connected to something timeless and healing. It was in that vast, quiet landscape that I rediscovered both my roots and myself. myself.
Wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Thinking about that Saturn ruling the midheaven, eighth house squaring the moon as the moon as IC ruler in the seventh, like moving with your partner because you get evicted and finding yourself in the like Arctic mountains.
Yeah, so there was definitely with the lunations that were happening on the IC in the second house, there were financial things that were happening at that time in terms of needing to work full time in order to make money and pay bills, and then having weird things start happening with the home and living situation due to the landlords at the time, and having this push for a move and a relocation with the partner that leads to reconnecting with one's roots and one's familial tradition in some ways.
Mm, such a beautiful example. Such
Yeah.
a like, yeah. I mean, I haven't seen that many second house IC examples, even in my client work when I was doing my research. So being able to see these and everyone who submitted them was really special.
Yeah, and it's important because it's sometimes it's through the timing things like
Hmm.
she was sharing that you really see it come out at the same time because you start seeing overlapping in this instance like second house and fourth house significations becoming prominent in the life in the same way in a way that's overlapping and reinforcing each other. So I did mean to yeah, there I did mean to say that even though in this instance, for example, while there's a the entire sign is marked with fourth house with IC and fourth house significations in Cancer as well as second house significations. The IC is a sensitive point. There is almost like a graph that you could draw where there's an intensity that kind of like
Yes,
peaks at the degree of the IC and then declines afterwards. But it
absolutely.
so it marks the entire sign with IC significations, whatever sign it's importing those fourth house significations into. But the actual degree and the degrees surrounding it are often experienced, especially in transits, as a period of heightened intensity with respect to the IC significations.
Absolutely 100%.
Yeah, so we'll see that come up more. Okay, awesome. Well,
So,
thanks to
yeah.
Joanna for submitting that. That was a great example.
So next we have this is our second and last second house example. It's Amber, and she's in or was born in Aberdeen, Scotland in 1991. Should we be reading the birth information out for the for the audio
No,
listeners? No. Okay.
that's okay. Let's just skip it. We'll just, especially
Cool.
because we want to get through, if we want to get through our 20 examples, let's just keep it concise to,
Yeah. Sounds
especially
good.
the IC placement.
Yeah. Agreed. Okay, so this is another Gemini rising Cancer IC example. We have a moon in Capricorn, of course, in the eighth with the midheaven. And Amber shares material wealth and income for me is like trying to collect water with a sieve. No matter how easily it flows, it always slips away. I've always had a steady job, yet any kind of material abundance remains elusive, diluted by a tide of hobbies, distractions, and quiet timidity that keeps me from expanding my horizons in the tangible world. So, second house ruled by the moon in detriment, the maternal element looms large. My relationship with my mother was tense growing up. I often felt like a fish out of water, never quite the daughter she wanted, though I can't fault her for her financial generosity in times of need. So, we see this moon, icy ruler moon in the eighth with the North Node, right? Offering generosity, but not necessarily the kind that Amber felt she needed, which is not an uncommon thing. And that South Node on the IC in the second house itself being this sieve that she talks about where her own ability to make money feels she says these issues have always felt amplified even against what could otherwise be seen as a very fortunate life.
Hmm. Okay. So yeah, there's some financial things as well as a little bit of like self-worth type things that are tied up with
Hmm.
the IC being in the second house.
Yeah, and one other thing she shares, often in unexpected ways, she does end up being frequently gifted or inherited things. So, for example, during one failed attempt to move abroad, a stranger gave me $50 when I had nothing left, enabling me to get to my half sister's house. Or when my partner and I moved into an unfurnished flat after a no-fault eviction, right? More eviction things. His mother gifted us an entire living room setup. So, and on a more permanent note, my parents have put their house in my name, so I will inherit it, probably my only tangible asset, which is ironic given my lifelong desire to get away.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah,
Nice. Absolutely.
feels so spot on.
That's good. And something we should mention, I forgot to mention that in the for the structure of the actual survey itself, that we asked people two primary questions, basically, or there were three fields, and the first field was like um, the first field said what if any, like ways if your IC falls outside of the fourth whole sign house, how do IC significations overlap with the
Mhm.
significations of the house that that it falls in any notable ways? And that's like the first paragraph we're reading. And then the second question we asked was, what house is the ruler of your IC placed in? And do you see any overlaps or connections between the IC house and the whole sign house that it's in and the house that the ruler is in? And this is where some of the additional delineations are coming from.
Yeah. Yep,
Cool.
really,
Okay.
really, people did so well. I was so impressed with everyone. So we'll go into sixth house ICs because these are the other examples of ones that are very not common, and you have to be the upper latitudes in the northern hemisphere, up in Scandinavia are quite populated, right? And quite a few English speakers, and I guess people who are into astrology, which is cool. So we did get a number of second house and sixth house examples from that. So our next
So, s-
example is Joe. This
s-
is the one. Oh,
real
sorry.
quick,
Yeah.
sixth house significations, real quick.
Yes.
For me are things like work, health, illness, and sometimes subordinates or people that work for you can come up in the sixth house.
Yeah, servitude for sure, I think is one that comes up, and that can be something when we're dealing with IC stuff. Like more often, I've seen like IC rulers in the sixth. There can be inherited experiences of that, and the way that the trauma of servitude, and of course, in some examples like literal slavery, which is a sixth house association traditionally, how that can be passed through the trauma of that through family lines is
Mm,
something that can come up in six health examples. Um,
okay.
yeah, so this is the one that we don't want to share, the place.
Place. Okay, so let me just get rid of the data altogether then, and I will just share the chart itself,
Great.
which is a chart with Sagittarius rising, and the IC is in Taurus in the sixth whole sign house.
Yes, so this is a quick one, but I wanted to share this one because this was not the only Sag Ascendant Taurus sixth house IC that we received that had an association with a family farm. And one of the other ones was literally a family dairy farm. So when we're thinking about Taurus, that is very, very, very spot on. And the sixth house as well. Um,
Right, and the
oh, sixth
sixth,
house also being domestic animals too.
that's what I was just thinking. It was also,
Yeah.
we often find animals and like pets in the sixth house.
And 12th house too, of course, with like larger animals as well, being I think cows are probably sort of one in the other. They belong in both houses different times. But so
Mm.
Amber, just real quick, shares my generation is the 10th on the same farm, very, very far north. A very practical family with seasonal routines, maybe not emotionally present, but practical and reliable, always helping each other. And with the ruler of Taurus is Venus, of course. And Joe's Venus is at 1 degree Virgo, right, near the top of the chart, even though it's quite far from the 12th house midheaven. And she shares Venus is in my 10th, and I work with remediation of soil, removing hidden pollution, cleaning, tidying, generational pollution projects from the subsurface of the soil. Like,
Wow,
just so good.
incredible.
I
I
love
like, I
that.
like,
Yeah.
I like that. I like also the simplicity of the initial delineation of just like the IC importing family significations into the sixth house, and the
Yes.
family has run a farm for 10 generations. So it's like literally the family and animals are the two primary archetypes coming together there in this instance.
Yeah, and I mean, we can also see some actual fourth house whole sign significations too, being like, say, the real estate aspect of it, right? Because it's Pisces in her chart, and Jupiter is in dignified in Sagittarius in her first house as well, which is just
Hmm.
like that is a fortunate um, a fortunate familial connection in terms of so this one. Some of the other examples as well, we can see this is a quite positive, albeit maybe not emotionally present, right? But there is a way that seeing the condition and placement and angularity of the IC sign rulers will often show not just the circumstances, but then how people feel toward the circumstances, right? Which we've seen that in a couple of
Mm.
these examples so far, where it's like might be quite fortunate circumstances, but how it actually lands is not so appreciated depending on other factors.
Yeah, people sometimes miss early, sometimes like intermediate astrology students struggle with that sometimes. Well, they'll have a placement in a certain part of their chart that's supposed to mean something, but there'll be like a maltreatment or there'll be something tricky about it, and it will actually be indicating a negation of those topics rather than an affirmation of those. So saying no to it rather than saying yes. And people will sometimes struggle with that because they assume the placement is always supposed to be an affirmative, but sometimes what's being indicated in your chart is like a negation or that you won't do that thing or that you won't feel good about that thing or that there's a problem there in some way.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have one more sixth house example, and that's the Cap Rising one.
Okay.
And this is an
Pull that.
example from Norway.
And this is okay to share the data.
Yes. Yeah.
O-
And so this is Capricorn rising and with a Gemini sixth house IC.
Okay.
So she shares, what I inherited and struggle with the most is the servitude work ethic of both my parents. I've always sacrificed my physical needs to serve others. My father worked as a carpenter, but got partly disabled due to injuries from the work wearing him out. He was not good at taking care of himself, eating or rest wise. My mother had to change jobs to a consultant desk job from being a nurse, which is also taking a toll on her, and she always works overtime. So there is a Venus on the IC is here, but it's still in the sixth house, right? And so those difficulties of that servitude, and then of course of illness, being another sixth house one that we didn't mention, being well, maybe we did, but being very, very prominent often. And so I see in the sixth being parents that overwork themselves to the point of illness feels very, very spot on.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very literal and makes a lot of sense.
So, the ruler of the IC here, bringing in a little bit of the fifth house example, because the ruler of that IC is Mercury in Taurus, which is very close to the sun, combust in the fifth house, and so Cap Rising studied art in 20s and drawing and art in general has always dealt with the themes such as daily routines, daily life, and work. I find the most inspiration at my work and have made several drawing portraits of my colleagues and my working space. Work was also very fun for me. I really love to work, but I have a hard time finding jobs that are compatible with my own health.
Hmm.
So,
Brilliant.
also just inherited illness in relationship to family is like such a potent piece of this part too.
Yeah, because there's a mutual reception here where
Hmm.
Gemini is the sixth whole sign house and also contains the IC, and it's ruled by Mercury, which is in Taurus in the fifth whole sign house. And then the ruler of the fifth house is Venus, which is placed in the sixth whole sign house, conjunct the degree of the IC. Whenever there's an exchange of signs between the house rulers, we've seen this over and over again in the houses series that it creates a strong connection between those two areas of the life. And this is a really good, vivid example of that.
hmm And of course, her own work being fun as well, because we have the other benefic is Jupiter in Scorpio in her 11th house, ruling the 12th house midheaven, which is also where her moon is, and that feels like that brings in some of that joy to her work as well, even if it's probably, and she didn't share, but it's even probably in 12th house topics, or will be eventually.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So that's the sixth house. Yeah.
hmm That's it for second and sixth.
Okay. So those are the two in terms of the majority of the charts that we collected, in terms of where the majority of our audience is, I think those are the outlier houses that we want to start with first. But the majority of examples that we have, and the majority of people have the IC either in the fourth whole sign house, or in the third whole sign house, or in the fifth whole sign house. So that is what we're going to talk about next. And shall we start with the third house?
Oh yeah. Oh, third house is so rich. I feel like it's one of the houses that people often have some trouble with because it seems like the significations don't really connect, but when you get to that root of like the joy of the moon, I feel like it really connects so much of the third house.
Yeah, for sure. So when we did the third house series, it was like communication was a core one, but also siblings, relatives, neighbors, the city that you live in and the surrounding neighborhood. Sometimes friends came up with a third house, especially like local friends or friends that you grew up with in your neighborhood as a result of proximity. And finally, short distance travel and like traveling around your city and your local environment and things like that were all very prominent themes.
Yeah, and bringing in that neighborhood vibe too, with like the idea of a temple or like your neighborhood gathering place, which is like sometimes a mall, but oftentimes, especially historically, it was a church or a mosque or a temple, and that being quite a prominent third house association too often.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. All right. So who's our first third house?
So
Or
we'll,
actually, let me give a couple of mine just to reiterate,
yeah, oh yeah, sure.
because that sets up an interesting context. One of my favorite ones from the fifth house, one that I just did that I happened to find in that context was the birth chart of Serena Williams. And I found this really brilliant because Serena Williams has Taurus rising and the IC is in Cancer in the third whole sign house. And the ruler of the IC in the third whole sign house is the moon, which is placed in the fifth house. So the way that this manifested in a very specific and literal way in her life is her parents, which is the IC, raised her and her sister, Venus Williams, to be chess champions. And especially her father developed this like strategy or this plan in order to make them like the biggest chess champions in the world, which was successful and they eventually actually became. And Serena is the younger of the two sisters. This is in tennis. And Serena, because she was the younger sibling, her older sister, Venus, is the one that started competing first. And so Venus sort of set the opened the path, and then Serena followed it afterwards. But then eventually, when they became older, because they were the two at the top of the field, they ended up competing with each other. And Serena, I think, often is sometimes interpreted as having come out on top or having won in that battle when it comes down to certain things. But I just thought it was brilliant that in this instance, it's like the IC, which is the parents, teaching her and her sister tennis together, which is the third house, siblings, and then the focus is on sports, which fundamentally is like normally like fun and games. It's something people do for leisurely activities, which is the fifth house, the ruler of it being in the fifth house. But in this instance, because it's like the moon is the sect light, because this is a night chart, and this became, part of her life's work was like becoming the biggest tennis champion in the world, but it was very much tied up with her parents and especially her sibling.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. The fifth house as well, we'll get into that in the fifth house example, but definitely games and gambling comes up in the fifth for sure. Um, I love that like Venus and Scorpio being ruled by, but then also like just separating from the Mars in the fourth too. And just like how that fourth house business can, it's got this Virgo moon, but then there's this probably kind of itchy quality and the competition aspect of it as well being down
Yeah, I
there.
mean, with the Mars in the fourth whole sign house, there's like things involving like her father and like the role he played in like pushing them and sometimes being somewhat overbearing. And, that was the movie that came out a few years ago that Will Smith played her father, and they called it King Richard, which really speaks to that like Mars and Leo in the fourth house placement and the role he played in the family. And then also just interestingly in terms of that was like the Oscar that Will Smith won, and then he went up and like slapped Chris Rock, and the controversy that broke out surrounding that, and just like yeah, there was like some Mars stuff there as
Mm.
well, but you get both.
Yeah, ninth house south node with the midheaven too, with the north node with the IC, and just like the way that the nodes are so wobbly and kind of chaotic and really draw focus. So that third
Hmm.
house sibling um, dynamic getting so much popular attention as well. Feels
For
like part of
sure, for
that.
sure.
Yeah,
So that was one, and
good.
then to contrast with that, I just found a new one last month where I was just like flipping through channels on Netflix after recording a long episode and taking it easy one day. And there was this new Netflix documentary that had just come out on Charlie Sheen. And I used him like a long time ago as a chart example of like Saturn in the 10th house in a night chart because he was like the highest paid actor in Hollywood. And then he went on this crazy like drug bender or something like that, and he just like threw it all away and walked away from it all in this fiery almost like downfall at the time. But he's since cleaned up and gone into recovery, and they released a Netflix documentary about him that coincided with the release of a book in September when the eclipse happened in Pisces, and it's partially him also I think trying to clean up his image or control the narrative a little bit about his story. But those issues aside, and there were many problematic issues in terms of him, so I'm certainly not endorsing any of that, but he has Gemini rising, and the IC is in Leo in the third whole sign house. And Mercury, the ruler of the Gemini ascendant, is there in Leo with that overlapping IC and third house placement. And what was very fascinating about the documentary is that it focused a lot on the important role that his brother and his father played in his life. And his brother, especially, Charlie, grew up shooting home movies with him because the father himself is the famous actor Martin Sheen, who was in like famous movies like Apocalypse Now. So his father was an actor, and that inspired Charlie and his brother to also start acting and shooting movies early on as they were growing up together on a home camcorder. And his brother was or is Emilio Estevez, who became a famous actor as well a little bit before Charlie in the 1980s, going into the 1990s. And then that was part of him and Charlie got a lot of experience shooting home movies together, and they were often like imitating what their father did, which is their father was sometimes in like violent movies where he was getting killed. And so they would sometimes like recreate these like violent movies in their home movies where they're getting killed in different ways. And then his older brother getting into acting first impressed a sense of um, Charlie of competition in the sense of like Charlie wanted that. He could see the access and the things his brother was getting access to. And so he partially followed in his steps into acting to achieve the same things. So there was just a lot of like third and fourth house significations that were very intense and very overlapping with this ruler of the ascendant being in the third whole sign house of siblings, but also co-present with the IC of parents and family at the same time.
And seeing that the opposition between that Sun ruling the IC and Saturn ruling the midheaven, and just
Hmm.
like often, the back and forth of like a downfall and a comeback and giving up on things. It's like that very classic push and pull with Pluto down there too,
Right, for sure, for sure.
and
Yeah,
that
and
being
that
wrapped up in the story. Yeah.
yeah, there was a quote at one point I wrote down that made me think of that Sun Saturn opposition, or the Sun conjunct Uranus and Pluto in the fourth whole sign house, where he said, quote, "We watched Dad die a lot." And he was talking about like m movies. They were like growing up, and like his father would like die in these movies, and so that left a little impression of like some sort. And I just thought that was such an interesting quote with that Sun Uranus Pluto conjunction in the fourth whole sign house opposing the Saturn. And that's one of the tricky things is you have to, when you're doing this, is reconcile that those fourth whole sign house placements are going to mean something and they're going to contribute something to the person's life. But then those IC significations are going to contribute something as well. Because the other part throughout the documentary is that his father was like constantly going to bat for him and constantly trying to help him through his drug addiction and trying to sometimes even when Charlie didn't want it, his father was trying to do what was best by like doing a press conference one time after he overdosed to say my son overdosed and to like air his private dirty laundry in order to try to force him to get help. But yeah, sometimes that's both good things and tricky things.
Yeah, and when you see something like this where the IC house that's other than the fourth and the fourth house are wrapped up, like there's often these conversations happening between the planets, right? Between the house rulerships. The
Hmm.
IC can often signal um, what ends up being most important when you're talking to a client, right? What ends up being most kind of affectively or somatically important to them. Because when we understand the angles um, to be the thing that is relevant and hyper localized to exactly where on Earth we were born at that time
Hmm.
versus the other motions of the planets as being sort of how the angles frame that, right? There's a way that the angles themselves, and of course, this makes sense with the ascendant being us, being the body, being that moment, but it happens with the other angles as well, where so it's like even though there is this heavy fourth house emphasis and it does rule the IC, that IC and that sibling relationship does have this not just psychological but formative importance when it comes to someone's relational field and how they simply experience the whole world and tend to think of themselves as well, but also other people. And it really, wherever the IC is, and we saw that in the sixth and second house examples, right? It tends to kind of structure the whole world around someone.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's what's important here is like if you just looked at this in a quadrant framework, you would get the
Hmm.
fourth house emphasis with the ruler of the
Yeah.
ascendant after the IC in the fourth quadrant house, but you would miss the third house component, the major role that his famous brother Emilio Estevez, who was like the same time Charlie was like a leading actor in Hollywood. You have this other guy who is his brother that's also very prominent and playing in Mighty Ducks is a pretty big movie. I don't know if you're the same age time frame as
Yeah.
I am, but
It's huge.
so yeah, so that there's other stuff there. I am trying to, and I would like to develop more of a conceptual distinction between what the whole sign house placements indicate versus what the quadrant or IC placements indicate. But currently, I just see a similarity and an overlapping of distinction of significations rather than something that I can firmly say this thing is doing this and this thing is doing this. And I'm still open to somebody like presenting that or still developing this as soon as I go further into the houses series about creating a firmer distinction if there is one, but I'm also open to that there may not be one just because of dealing with two different frames of reference that have similar meanings of certain sectors that we're looking at.
Yeah, the IC is canonically, I mean, once you get to the midheaven, I feel like that might end up making this more clear.
Hmm.
Because when you see the midheaven floating around in the different signs up top, and you actually can trace those to people's like more conscious and more obvious contributions, I think I think that's probably going to be more clear than the IC because the IC, as we talked about by its nature, is there's secrets down there. Like when I sit with people in sessions and we're focusing on the IC, so often they have no idea when they walk into it, right? When they walk in to talk to me, and then we end up talking about all these other things, and then eventually we kind of like spiral around into exactly, and they're like, oh, that's my IC, right? But it takes a lot of looking around, right? Wandering around in the dark, bumping into things in order to be able to tell where you are when you're trying to look at the IC.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I guess I just like for myself, for example, I have my Aquarius rising and I have my 10th whole sign house as Scorpio. And when I have transits, like I just had Mars like go through my 10th whole sign house. And like within 24 hours of Mars going into the 10th whole sign house, my website was crashed like catastrophically and was hacked. And I dealt with that over the course of the past month and a half as Mars is going through my 10th whole sign house. But then because my midheaven is in early in Sagittarius in my 11th whole sign house, I know that there's going to be a continuation of 10th house themes as Mars goes in there. And it will add an additional element, which is also like 11th house themes when Mars goes in there. But I don't see experientially in terms of transits a major distinction. Instead, I just see a continuation of similar themes between those two so that I'm not, while I haven't fully set down my final word on this, I'm not committed to that there definitely is a like conceptual distinction between, let's say, the whole sign versus the quadrant house placements. Sometimes people try to say like maybe the quadrant house placements are more psychological and the whole sign placements are more literal, but the problem with that, I think, is that may just be a byproduct of people associating quadrant houses with modern astrology and like whole sign with more predictive ancient Hellenistic or traditional astrology. So that may just be a temporary like byproduct of where we find ourselves at this place in time rather than something that's true when you get down to it with charts.
Yeah, I think that's not the case. I resist, even though I have that psychological modern astrology training, I definitely understand the like subjective and objective experiences, right? To be a lot less different than people actually think, but and to be a byproduct of American cultural narcissism mostly, right? And I
Hmm.
basically, a lot of my work serves as a kind of antidote or repair to all the damage that has done without throughout people's families. And I think accepting that the chart is both the whole world and that our experience of the world is representative in some way that is valid and sort of repairing that disconnection. And so toward a distinction between the quadrant and the whole sign, I'm of the Mercurial mind, right? I think that we can see everything in both, likely, and there's ways that understanding the whole sign house approach when we're thinking about the angles, especially, and we're thinking about the midheaven IC, especially, I do think it kind of reroutes us, like not just in the lineage of astrology, right, of hundreds and thousands and millennia of understanding the way that the earth and sky are so connected within these very elegant schemas, right? There's something so rich in that, but it's also a way that it allows quadrant house cusps to be a tool in the toolkit that is grounded in these ways that allows us, I think, more complexity and more nuance in part because of the seeming simplicity of it,
Hmm. Right.
which doesn't answer your question, but
Okay. Well, maybe by the end of this, okay, you have until the end of this episode to
okay.
answer definitively. One of the greatest questions of the modern contemporary astrology. So let me give just one more example and then we'll get into
Yeah.
the user submitted ones. This was a really good one that we found during the third house series that my friend Nick Dig Invest had originally pointed out to me. But this is the birth chart of Jack Nicholson, and he was born with Leo rising, and the degree of the IC is in Libra in the third whole sign house, the place of siblings. And the ruler of this is a retrograde Venus, which is in Aries on the degree of the midheaven in the ninth whole sign house. So, what was important about this example is that Jack Nicholson um, grew up believing that the person who was his biological mother was actually his sister because she had him when she was younger out of wedlock, and it was in like the 1930s, so it was more of a social or societal issue at the time where there would have been a stigma. So instead, his grandmother raised him, and he always grew up believing that his grandmother was his mother, which is also a third house signification. We're getting like grandparents here in the third house, and we're also getting siblings, and we're also getting parents. And it's funny because it's ruled by this retrograde Venus in Aries, and it's a weird situation with his mother and his grandmother. And the further like bizarre part is he didn't learn about this until after both of them had already passed away. And a news reporter like found out and approached him about it while he was promoting a movie. And he actually had to ask his older, I believe it was his sister about this, and she knew, and she had to fess up at that point and tell him that was true. And it was like this huge like moment for him that changed everything he knew about his his origins and his early life, and the person he thought his mother was his mother versus his sister and everything else. So I thought this was one of the most brilliant examples of having the IC, the place of parents in the third whole sign house, which is the place of siblings as well as other extended relatives that I've ever seen.
Yeah, and the having that Mars and Sag with the North Node in that trine and ruling, right? The Venus midheaven too, and the fact that like it did come out eventually, um, is feels very like prominent and tender as well, rather than it just staying a secret forever.
Right. Or I mean the other part is like Pluto's at 26 degrees of Cancer, and it's like squaring the
Yeah.
IC at
Mhm.
22 Libra, and it's also squaring that Venus, the ruler of the IC, at 24 degrees of Aries. So there's this Pluto element to things in the 12th house, and some of the secrecy and other types of significations that come up with the 12th.
Yeah, and within a minute, that opposition with Jupiter ruling the Saturn eighth too, which of course is
Hmm.
opposite the moon and the 12th, the other place of that secrets like that are kept.
Yeah. All right, so those
Yeah.
are the last of my examples that I've found while I've been doing this research over the past year. Tell me about some of the submissions that came in from listeners that have the
Yeah.
IC in the third.
Okay, so I think we won't pull up charts for all of these because some of them are pretty quick.
Okay,
But we will pull up a chart for our first one, who is Gia. So that's the first third house I see.
so this is Gia's chart, who has Taurus rising, the IC in Cancer in the third whole sign house.
Yeah, so this is one of our youngest examples. I tried to allow for some representative spread sampling, but we were also looking for a certain amount of representation in terms of chart ruler signs and things like that, and then also the actual experiences. So I didn't necessarily choose like the absolute astrologer best examples, or the most intense ones or things like that, but ones that gave a sort of nice overview of examples of what kinds of charts you might see. So of course, this is the IC ruler with the IC, with the moon in the third house, and then we would expect the siblings to show up, especially in this one. And what's this is interesting, and just like a content warning that I do mention stillbirth in this, although it's not graphic or anything like that. So Gia shares. I do not have any siblings, although I am a rainbow baby. The stillbirth of my sister profoundly affected my family and resulted in my mother's mental decline and her passing. Um, my immediate family is just my dad and me. We have the moon, we both have the moon in Cancer, Sun in Pisces, and Mercury in Aries. So there's a direct father connection as well. Um, I have been blessed with friends who consider me to be siblings. They have offered me food, shelter, and companionship. I have spent holidays with their families and siblings. I also have a close relationship with my dad's brother. So, this is an uncle. This is more of that third house, extended family, extended relatives. For someone
Mm,
with no living siblings, I'm very blessed with a multitude of sibling like relationships. And also shares that basically everything in their chart ends back to that Mars and Scorpio and the descendant, but except for the moon. And so they take the moon very the feels a lot of responsibility with the moon, protecting home and the expansion of that to the earth as home as well as loved ones is something that Gia writes and speaks about often. And so there's communication themes there too in being a writer.
nice.
Yeah.
Nice. I like that. This is a good example of what we were talking about earlier. It's a mixed example, but where there's can sometimes be a negation of things because
Mm,
it's like we have Saturn and Aries in the 12th house, and
yeah.
it's sort of overcoming through a superior square the moon in Cancer and the IC in the third. And there's like this negation of the topic of siblings that happens. Was it an older sibling or a younger sibling? Did they specify?
Would be older, because if they're considered a rainbow baby, that means that they're older. Their parents had tried to have a child before and couldn't, and then they got their rainbow baby, who is the baby who comes often after miscarriage or stillbirth, or just fertility struggles generally.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I was one of those as well. Sometimes one of the things that Rhetorius talks about in the 6th century is how the 12th house was like the sign that was rising prior to birth. And so sometimes it indicates that which happens prior to when you were born. And I think that's part of what's going on here as well in terms of the Saturn in the 12th and that overcoming square with the Cancer planets. But then it's like you also have the two benefics are also in Aries, overcoming that, sending in um, other testimony, more positive testimony to that third house, which is helping to affirm the moon being in its own sign. So it's like you're getting a mixed case of negation from Saturn and then affirmation from Venus and Jupiter.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Beautiful.
Good examples. So what's the next one?
Yeah, I think this is our one Scorpio IC ruler example. So why don't you pull up the chart? So this is Meg, third house. It should be the next one.
Here is the chart. So we're looking at a Gemini rising with the IC and Leo chart.
Yes, Gemini rising, IC in Leo, Sun in Scorpio with a whole stellium of Saturn, Sun, Moon, South Node, Pluto, and Venus.
Nice.
So this is an example of IC ruler in the sixth, and then also with the midheaven ruler co-present with the IC ruler as well, which often shows up in a whole intensity of emphasis in whatever house it's in, and so even in a cadent house such as this one. So Meg shares that she has always been the black sheep of the family, despite being the oldest of four girls. So her siblings have a very significant impact of her life. Her sisters live conventional, quote unquote, lives, stayed within a certain radius of where they grew up, all got married to men, have children, versus Meg is single, child free, and moved to another state. She has typical sibling relationships with them. Sometimes they fight like crazy, sometimes they're besties, she feels a weird pressure to try and live up to their standards, even though as the oldest, I was supposed to pave the way. And she does reference the Sun-Saturn conjunction as being part of this kind of, which I suppose is almost an inferiority complex. She also shares that the 9-degree Leo, which is her IC, is also family lineage. That was her mom's moon to the degree, and grandmother's midheaven was also 9 degrees Leo. And so there's a bit of breaking away from this. I think the co-presence with the moon in Scorpio and the Venus in Scorpio, let alone with the South Node and Saturn in a night chart, just and Pluto too. There is that it feels quite black sheep with all of that being ruled by a fifth house Mars in Libra, even.
Right. Yeah, yeah, just night chart Saturn, and you have the most positive and challenging planet in Scorpio on either side of that sun as the ruler of the third house in the IC, and just you get a lot of those the heaviness of those feelings of responsibility due to the Sun Saturn conjunction ruling that as she said.
100%. The sixth house comes in that she shares she has always had an almost obsessive desire to control her siblings' health from the standpoint of worrying about their safety and wanting them to be healthy and well. I cannot
Nice.
stand about them being sick or hurt. I am the person who always sends my family articles about the latest diseases that has popped up, reminding them to get their vaccinations, panicking about COVID, etc. But she also shares that this has caused friction in the family, to the point that she put her foot down last year and didn't end up going home for Christmas for the first time ever, because of some of these health concerns and the divisiveness and friction that she experienced in doing that, even though it was the right thing to do. So that's also
Mm,
very, very sixth, very separation from family, even when the family is that. Oh, well, I guess also there's the fourth house being ruled by Virgo, as well as the ascendant in Gemini, right? Being in the seventh with the descendant in Sagittarius. And so that's also a planet in detriment, having a lot of say over the situation.
sure. Having the ruler of the third house and the fourth house in the sixth house of illness and health and conjunct Saturn in a night chart, and just like you said, a feeling
Yeah.
of distance or even alienation in that instance as a result of the focus on health issues related to the family and the siblings.
hmm Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a really strong third house Leo example. And
definitely.
kindness to Meg, and of course everyone else sharing these like very vulnerable, often painful things that we do often find at the IC.
Hmm. Definitely. All right, let's move on.
Hmm. Let's see, who do we want to do next? The next one I think is actually more of a midheaven example, so maybe you'll want this when you get around to doing that. We'll
Yeah.
go to Victoria, who is a third house Libra IC. And I love this example so much. This was one of my
Okay.
favorites.
Okay, so we got Leo rising, we got the IC and late Libra in the third whole sign house, along with the Sun, Mars, and Mercury in a night chart.
Ruled by Venus and Sag in the fifth. And so when we're thinking about these house topics, we can see how the third, fourth, and fifth get kind of pulled together in this example just so clearly. Victoria shares, I am an only child, but have kept the same group of friends since middle school who feel like sisters to me. In terms of neighbors, I've always made friends with and maintained friendships with my neighbors even after I move. I also like to make friends with the people working at stores I frequent. This is so third house. Having like a neighborhood errand route is, as a third house person myself, an extremely important aspect of third house life. And so Venus and Sag ruling the fifth and in the fifth rather. And she used to coordinate weddings and do floral design. Worked at a law firm for a few years after she became a mom, but now she's a stay-at-home mom. She spends most of her time doing third house things now, driving around, running errands, chatting with friends on the phone, shopping, and always have some home decor project going on. So this is so icy. Really lucky at thrifting and finding cool stuff on the side of the road, which is technically my old neighbor's stuff. right? I feel like that's such a cute example. And this is one of my favorite parts. And this is very dignified Saturn opposite exalted Jupiter too, I feel like in the sixth and 12th. Though we're not talking about that, but it feels relevant
Right.
because it's square, all that stuff in the IC. So when she was doing floral design, she shares, I had a nonprofit that collected past sale by date flowers from local grocers and the arrangements from events I coordinated to give to hospice and long-term care facilities. I wasn't aware of the astrology at the time, but in retrospect, it tied in the third, driving around to pick up stuff from venues and markets, the fifth, creating floral designs, and 12th, where I have Jupiter in Cancer, emotionally caring for people in institutions.
Wow. Nice.
Spot on, right? And
Yeah, that's pretty
she
good.
wasn't sure if we were going to follow up or not. So she shared, if y'all do this thing on Saturday and want to chat, would you please be so kind as to give me a heads up? I'll be at my neighbor's annual cowboy cookout party. It just
Nice.
feels so like Venus and Sag, fifth house ruling a Libra IC. So
Yeah,
good.
the role of parties in association with the fifth house was something that was I didn't not recognize, but it became much more prominent when we did the Fifth House series. And there was, I remember now, there was a one of the examples I forgot to include here was there was a listener who had the IC in the fifth whole sign house, and they said when they grew up, their family was constantly hosting parties, and that that was like a major part of their life, and that the idea of like hosting parties at home continued on into adulthood in a major way.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, we'll see some of that in a couple of the fifth house examples if we get to those ones.
This
Um,
this example also
yeah.
brought up the topic of early childhood education, like kindergarten through high school, basically, or anything below college, and how that really does, even though that's more of a modern thing, like we really did see that come up very
Mhm.
prominently in charts very frequently in the third house.
Yeah, well, when you think that like even before such structured collective public school, like public schooling's fairly new, right, in the history of
Mm,
humanity. And the
mm,
idea that like it was your neighbors, like you had kids, it was the families, it was like your neighbors' families were constantly taking in the kids. There is like an early childhood component to the third house, and also like churches and temples and these places were places, I mean they still are to a certain extent, but in a more limited space, but they're places of childcare, and that feels like one of the connections to the third house for sure.
totally. That makes so much sense. And also the idea that we even still have today sometimes of the image of like all your entire schooling is like in your neighborhood or pretty local to you for your entire
Yeah.
life until you hit that point when you're around like 18 and then you go away to college and you it's the first time for many people that you're like moving out of your home or like the image you see in of like parents like helping their kid to like move to college across to a different state or something like that.
Yeah, 100% third house things. I love
Yeah,
that. Yeah,
totally. All right, cool.
let's pull up Amelia.
Okay, there
This
we
is
go.
a third house Virgo IC. And this Cancer rising Virgo third house is one of the most common third houses I see coming from where my clients are mostly, which is North America and Europe. So
Hmm.
this is one that there was quite a few examples of real spot on things. Um,
So
and
this
so
is Cancer rising.
mm,
I see in late Virgo, conjunct Saturn, and Jupiter is also in the third whole sign house in Virgo with those two placements in a day chart.
Yeah. And this one is, so there's quite a lot going on in this one, but the thing I want to pull out the most is that um, this person, so she shares in my early school age years, which we were just talking about, I was boarded or privately fostered out to families so she could go to a better school while her mother worked in the city because the commute was too
Hmm.
long daily. And
Wow.
the father left or abandoned their family when she was only 6 months old, which is, I feel like there's that Saturn on the IC hangs very heavy. Third house piece of this, and then we're looking at the Virgo IC with Mercury in Pisces with the midheaven in the ninth. And so this boarding situation morphed into more long-term situations when her mother left for up to 3 months out of the year to do solitary Buddhist retreats. And then,
What?
so then she was boarded out to families in that Buddhist community and then eventually moved abroad. Her mother eventually moved abroad to be closer to her guru. So she shares, she was colloquially called a Dharma brat. So she was born and raised as a white Westerner into a Tibetan Buddhist religion. And her whole childhood and all of the experiences from early education to traveling abroad to being boarded out with other families were dictated around the culture of this religious institution and mother's spiritual pursuits, for better or worse. And so we see this, yeah,
How
midheaven ruler,
literal.
right? Midheaven ruler too, Jupiter being in Virgo with Saturn with the IC, and that being like the mother's spiritual pursuits, creating like displacement of her own from her family, and then like her living, moving abroad as well.
Incredible. That's just absolutely incredible. And it's like, how do you, I'm trying to like, how would you get that without looking at it from this perspective and like seeing,
Yeah.
because that's such a unique and complex delineation, but we can kind of see it perfectly here with that, Saturn on the IC in the third whole sign house, ruled by Mercury in the ninth by, I guess it's by sign and by quadrant. Um, yeah, that's just brilliant though.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah, I love that one.
And then not to get, I mean, there's additional things that are being contributed by,
Yes.
the Venus ruling the fourth whole sign house and being placed in the 12th. But yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
love that. Okay, so we'll do one more third house. Wait, is that right? Yeah, one more third house. So this is S. So this is another Virgo example. So this will give us some ability to sort of see how different Mercuries function.
Okay. So we got
And then that's it for our
Cancer
third house.
rising,
Mm-hmm. Cancer
Cancer
rising.
rising. I see in Virgo in the third with Jupiter, and the ruler this time is Mercury in Aries in the 10th whole sign house.
Mm-hmm. So my IC is in third whole sign house, but also another one without actual siblings, only child. Childhood was notably very isolating and lonely. My parents were refugees, so this involved a lot of administrative work on my part as a child, as I could read and write English better than them, even from an early age. Unfortunately, these responsibilities have carried on into my adult life. I also have Jupiter stationing direct in my third house, so I think it's an important house for me. And then the ruler being Mercury in Aries in the 10th. Um, Dad started a business when I was a teenager, and my mom and I started working for him. I've now been running that business as they are no longer able to because of their age and bad health. I have to do this for a couple more years as it supports them financially until they reach retirement age. So that 10th house ruler being such such a like visible part of their life and being like such an important large part of their life, but at the same time being in the 10th versus their actual midheavens in the ninth, right? And so it's not necessarily what they want to be doing or what they would feel compelled to do, but is a major part of their story. And the translation, immigration paperwork piece of things is
Hmm.
that Jupiter in Virgo with the IC in the third. It's it's really spot on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just the travel component of the third house is really important here. And obviously, they have ninth house stuff going on with the moon and Mars there in a day chart. But the
Yeah.
I see in the third house and just how all of the declining houses, the third, sixth,
Hmm.
ninth, and 12th, can bring in travel significations and that element of the parents being refugees, and then because they could read and write English better than their parents, how they often would have ended up helping them to communicate basically, which is the third house component, but it's being brought into play for the parents with this, which is the IC.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, also shared. We moved a lot when I was a child, maybe 20 times. This was common whilst you were waiting for permanent residency. Sometimes this made it so I had to travel to school for 2 hours each way. Other times I was just a 10-minute walk from school. So that's so um, Virgo IC, third house. Yeah, with the Jupiter and Virgo down there too.
Absolutely, yeah. So moving around IC constantly was causing issues with early childhood schooling and a feeling of like unsettledness there.
Yeah.
Nice. All
Yeah.
right.
Fifth
Um,
house.
okay, so that's it for the third house. Okay,
Yeah,
so
I think so.
that was good. So that was really good. I think we saw a lot of good elements and we brought in almost all of the significations that we mentioned at the beginning and also remembered some new ones during the course of that. So that is the IC in the third whole sign house. So now we're gonna skip the fourth IC in the fourth whole sign house and we're gonna jump into our other big section, and I think it's actually our last section with the degree of the IC in the fifth whole sign house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
What are
sounds
so
good.
our fifth house significations? I just did a whole episode on this. Are things like primarily children. The fifth house indicates the topic of children, but the fifth house also indicates traditionally the place of pleasures and fun and enjoyment. It can indicate games and leisurely activities. It can also relate heavily to the topic of sex and sexuality, comes up as very prominent with the fifth house. Is there any other major things I forgot to mention?
Those are most of them for sure. Yeah, like art being a big one, art and children, literal babies. Um, hmm
Yeah, creativity, the idea or the concept of creation or that which you create, as well as that which
Yeah,
you contribute, and through your contribution or creation of that, that which may survive you or become part of your legacy in some sense.
yeah, 100%.
Maybe I should give really quickly
Oh
some of
yeah.
my ones that we've already given in the other series. So some of my celebrity ones. So one of those was Francis Ford Coppola,
Mm.
who's a famous movie director who directed The Godfather and Apocalypse Now and a bunch of other things like that. He was born with Capricorn rising, and the IC is in Taurus in the fifth whole sign house. And one of the things that he would do that was really important to him is that he would bring his family wherever he was shooting a movie, even if that was like in a different country, he would like uproot the entire family and take them all over there. So famously, when he shot Apocalypse Now in I think it was like the Philippines or somewhere. He took his entire family over there for months, even though ended up being a famously long and troubled and sort of like disastrous production. Which I think his wife even like shot a documentary about at one point that was released later and became very famous. But that was shooting movies and stuff, it was a family affair. And then of course, through that, one of the things he did very early on is he started collaborating on films with his daughter, Sofia Coppola. And then he taught her and she learned a lot about filmmaking through the process of growing up with a famous director dad and then ended up acting in one of his films, Godfather 3, which didn't go super well, but then later on she became a famous director in her own right at this point and established herself. So this important fourth house family component with the IC and fifth house creativity component.
Oh yeah, that's spot on. I love that. Venus, Jupiter, and Pisces.
So so get this, Sophia Coppola was born with Aquarius rising, and the IC is in Gemini in the fifth whole sign house. So it's like then you think about that from her perspective, and she grows up with a famous creative father who works together with her and helps to support and like encourage her own creative impulses and endeavors and things like that. And that was actually a common theme that I found in the Fifth House series when the IC was there, when the ruler of the fourth was in the fifth, was like having a family, a scenario where imagine if your family is like supportive of your creative endeavors in some sense, especially if it's well placed, as opposed to sometimes the opposite, if let's say your family is not supportive of your creative endeavors.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, with the Mercury there too, and the sign trine with the Jupiter ruling and right on the midheaven.
Yeah. So one of the themes that did come up sometimes, though, with the IC in the fifth house is some of the contemporary discussions about like nepotism when one is getting roles or something, let's say in acting or in other fields, partially as a result of their family connections, let's say. So for example, Sofia Coppola was cast, I think, as like a teenager in The Godfather 3, and then a lot of critics panned her performance or said it wasn't very good and that she this sort of criticized her acting, and it was kind of actually a very tough experience for her. But then in the future, she ended up going more into directing rather than acting and became a successful and famous director in her own right, eventually, and established herself. But sometimes that topic can come into play in contemporary discussions, or that's one area where we can see where some of those contemporary discussions can come from.
Yeah, and even with her son Saturn too, like in the actual fourth, right? And like the expectations that can come with the expectations that then lead to sort of public vulnerability feels wrapped up in that signature as well.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing about both of them is even though I'm focusing on the IC here, the really interesting thing about both of their charts is that both of them, she has Aquarius rising with the ruler of the ascendant Saturn in the fourth house of home and parents, and like
Hmm.
she has this really famous father, and her family is really important to her. Although, like I just said, she had that really difficult time as a teenager where her father cast her in this huge movie, the third movie in the Godfather series after the follow-up of the first two movies that were widely hailed as two of the most important or most successful movies of the 20th century. And then she plays a prominent role in that, but then just gets panned by critics. And I'm sure that was a really difficult experience. And interestingly, like he has Capricorn rising, but then he also has Saturn in
Oh
Aries in the fourth whole
yeah.
sign house. And the part about that for him that was interesting as well is like he was selected as the director of the Godfather movie. Um, and he did it, and part of the reason it worked out was because of his family background, because he had Italian heritage as an Italian American and coming from an Italian American family. And he incorporated that into directing the movie. And that's part of what made the movie more authentic in terms of The Godfather as a representation of the Italian American experience. So there's a lot of things that is very important about the fourth whole sign house placement here. It's not all just about the IC, but you can see how both of those sort of work in tandem.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially
Yeah.
that, like the f fifth house ruler in the third, and that being like a generational signature feels very potent in this example.
Yeah, that's a great point because that it's like that Venus rules the IC in the fifth house of creativity as well as the 10th whole sign house of career, and it's exalted in the third whole sign house, which is especially like communication and things like that. One of the funny things about that is his father. He had his father was a musician, and he had his father like score, I think, one or two of the Godfather movies, and his father won like an Academy Award for it, I think. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, film sets are so third house in so many ways too. There's
Yeah.
can be so chaotic and there's so much going on.
So two other examples. One of them, this is Tori Spelling's chart with Aquarius rising, and Saturn is in the fifth whole sign house in Gemini, along with Venus and the IC in a night chart. So you have the most positive planet, the most challenging planet there in the fifth house of creativity with the IC of like parents. And her father was a famous television producer, Aaron Spelling, in like the 60s and 70s and 80s. And in the 1990s, he created a new television series called 90210 that was about like teenagers. But he cast his teenage daughter, who's Tori Spelling, in like one of the lead roles. And in the 90s, like going way back over 30 years ago, this is one of the earliest discussions I remember hearing about like ideas of like nepotism and like having a famous parent who's like casting their child in a role, and like whether the child is like up for it acting wise or if there's a disparity between them and other actors and things like that. And we don't have to get into like the pros and cons of whether that was true or different things like that, but just the fact that there were discussions like that taking place surrounding her father putting her in a role like this is interesting as a parallel with like Sofia Coppola, for example.
And Venus right on the IC there. Yeah,
Yeah, and
with
a mutual
Saturn, but with
reception
those, yeah. And
with
with those
Mercury.
gifts, and then also, yeah, becoming a superstar of her own accord after that,
Totally.
despite that, yeah.
Absolutely. And then finally, I believe the last example I was going to share here that we had found was just this is the birth chart of Billie Jean King, who is a tennis champion, and she was born with Capricorn rising, and the IC is in Taurus in the fifth whole sign house, the place of games and sports, and the ruler of the fifth house is Venus in the 10th whole sign house of career, dignified and very well placed in its domicile in its own sign of Libra. And Billie Jean King grew up in a very athletic family where both her father and her mother were athletic, and they were very, very supportive of athletics and eventually of Billie Jean King herself getting into sports. But it was in a very supportive, like loving context where when she would come home from playing a game, they wouldn't ask her, did you win? They would ask her instead, did you have fun? Did you have a good time? And so, this in this instance, the positive indications were like having a supporting parental situation I see within the context of her playing sports and games, which is the fifth house, and then that ultimately leading eventually to her having major career success, which is Venus in the 10th house of career in its own domicile and becoming like a leading tennis player in the world at some point in the future as an adult.
Yeah, that's a really impressive one.
Yeah, so it's just a good idea of how sometimes the IC can tell you, what is the support system like in terms of your parents or your early home
Yeah.
situation, and how does that contribute sometimes to the other topics of the house that it falls in?
Yeah, absolutely. And you see that so starkly in the fifth house ICs for the people who are artists or are creators of some kind, because the 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 presence or absence of support, right? And I feel like this is that negation that you're speaking of too, is because there can be an emphasis there when really what we're seeing is an absence of support for their art careers, etc. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've got to be open to the inversion of that or the negation of that as well, not just the affirmation. Like hers is a great chart because it's like the ruler especially is super well placed, so there's a positive affirmation of that. But in the other instances, you could have, let's say, whatever the most challenging scenario is that we could possibly imagine connected with the IC in the fifth house, and let's say the parents were the opposite, that they were not supportive or they didn't believe in that that person could do that as like a career, and therefore they told them to get a real job, and like and that
Hmm.
they didn't follow their creative dreams in the end as a result of an unsupportive parent, let's say. Or one of the things we commonly see with the fifth house, I see with the fifth house and the IC there, especially in contemporary times, could be if there's issues with sexual orientation, and let's say the native is gay, but that their parents are like not supportive of that, for example, so that there's a tension there between parents, and the fifth house of like sexual orientation can sometimes come up as a topic or theme.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where it really serves us, especially as consulting astrologers, but also just people who care about astrology in expanding our ideas of what the IC can offer too. Because so much, I mean, I'm a practitioner in training in the Dr. Daniel For's ancestral medicine program as well. And so I think a lot about the ancestors in tandem with the IC work and understanding that especially queer people have so many ancestors of queerness and ancestors of culture and ancestors of art with which to relate actively with and in this supportive way, even if the biofamily is estranged or downright harmful. it can be, especially for folks who have that IC in the fifth and who are artists, this can just be such a powerful realization to be like, oh yeah, I actually am part of so many lineages that they just aren't fourth housey kind of stuff, right? Like they are in the way that they are this grounding, but they're not necessarily my family of origin. Like I'm not limited to that. And I feel like we see a lot of that I work with a lot of queer clients, and I see a lot of that in my practice as well.
Absolutely. That's a great point. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, we have a I think we want to pull up Caro's chart, which
Okay.
is the fifth house Aries example. This relates to the performing piece and the childhood performance piece, and um, she wrote really eloquently about it. So we're seeing a Sag rising chart with an Aries IC, and this is another example of the ruler of the IC being on the IC. I feel like these ones are really instructive from like a teaching perspective because they're just such distillations,
Mm.
and okay, Caro shares, I have my IC in Aries in my fifth house with my natal ruler Mars. I grew up with parents that would have explosive fights, verbal, sometimes turning physical, and then the next day, both parents seemingly moving on as if nothing happened. They eventually divorced and both moved on, remarried very quickly. My mom has been remarried several times now. My stepdad, who she divorced, is an Aries sun and an army veteran and was in my life since I was a little girl. So that's also, especially with Marsy ICs, we see presence of military often. Um, I got along with him great, and he was actually a calming presence. But the mom, who we're looking at this Venus and Libra in the midheaven in part for that, and then we're also thinking about the 10th house ruler, Sun and Scorpio, which I feel like we can see both of these on and off. Um, the mom is often instigating the arguments. And oh, one aside here, because she mentions a Disney World connection, there were so many Disney World and Disneyland connections in the fifth house IC examples,
Mhm.
which just feels like very spot on for fifth house. And then this is the part where we get into real fifth house stuff. So, dance and performing played a big part of my childhood and as a form of escapism from the turbulence in my home. For example, I would often be at a dance studio for hours taking classes, and I was part of a dance company competition team. It felt like a home away from home. I not only felt more seen and recognized by others when I was performing, but often received much joy and fulfillment from this. One year I received a reward for an award for best performer of the dance company. When my parents divorced and I had to move and leave my dance studio of many years, it was a deeply painful time in my life. And then also she
Wow.
mentions being active at summer camp and that being one of her favorite times of year. So add summer camp to fifth house, fifth house significations as well.
I love that. That's great. Yeah, that's a really good example of it's a day chart. So Mars is the more challenging planet. It is dignified in its own sign, which helps a bit, and then it also has a nice sextile with Jupiter in early Gemini, which is also offsetting and affirming things a bit. But that a lot of the early experience of that was in the conflict between the parents, which is Mars conjunct the IC, and their separation, which is Mars. But then how their outlet and one of the ways of getting away from that was channeling that into the creative impulse, which is also very strong, which is the fifth house.
Yeah, and seeing the this really strong expression of the Mars opposite Venus with the IC in midheaven really like doubling down on all those significations and with the moon wrapped up in there with trine and sextile in her first feels like it really brings all that forward and she's obviously, very like articulate about this experience and very aware of it and it's like a um very felt experience for her. And I think oftentimes that's kind of how we get to see these IC stories is when they do they do just come to awareness and we're able to articulate them. And even that process itself can be, yeah, really healing and attentive to a lot of the childhood wounds that we do tend to hold at our IC.
Hmm, definitely. Yeah. That was a cool keyword though, that the home away from home I see was at the dance company sort of
Hmm.
studio, basically, the place of creativity, the place of the creative outlet. So that's a good one I'm gonna put in my memory banks for the future as an archetypal outcome of that placement.
Yeah. And I think even just like a I see not in the fourth, home away from home feels like it covers a lot of the basis of that. We'll pull
Yeah.
up Ellie. This one's really quick, but I want us to see it in comparison to this one in part. So this is
Okay.
another Aries, Sag rising Aries IC, but rather than Mars on the IC in Aries, we have Mars with the midheaven in Libra, with also Venus in Libra up there. And so this is Ellie, and she shares that my father was a theater impresario in London's West End, and in his younger years was a musician in the London Symphony Orchestra. My mother was a ballerina for the Royal Ballet. So we have Venus and Mars in Libra in the midheaven, quite far away from the IC and from her moon, which is also in the IC, and in a very tight opposition to that Mars. And so she says that she doesn't quite see the direct connection, but she did choose to do the polar opposite to her parents for a career, and that her parents were disappointed. So instead of going into the arts, she went into economics. And also
Nice.
that she devoted her life to her daughter, who has represented her career for the last decade or so.
So, okay, so the initial part of the delineation makes sense. Both of the parents were creatives with the IC in the fifth whole sign house. But then she chose not to follow in the parents' creative direction, which is like the ruler of the fifth in the IC being Mars in the sign of its antithesis or exile, which is in Libra in the 11th whole sign house with the midheaven.
Hmm.
And then what's the bit about the
And then
daughter?
so her daughter has represented her career for the last decade or so, and then she also chose economics rather than going into the arts. So having that, and I wonder if we could see, yeah, so having just the choosing to do the direct opposite of what your parents do, I feel like is a very moon icy opposite the rulers, opposite your midheaven experience. And then also, this is where that very direct delineation of icy in the fifth, where, and this came up in numerous examples of people saying, like, I didn't really have that much connection to my family until I had children, and then my children became my family. And that seems to be a very common fifth house experience.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, okay, and decided to study economics. The ruler of the eighth is in the fifth, which could be part of the tension there in terms of the parents and the focus on financial matters, causing a tension. The ruler of the second is Saturn in the ninth, and studying financial matters. There's interesting, just like additional pieces I might connect in, or at least when I hear
Mm.
certain keywords, I look at certain houses and wonder and look at what the ruler is doing.
Yeah, if I was to follow up with this person, I would probably ask about their spouse. So consider what this Jupiter in Gemini is contributing, especially to that Mercury, to the Libra by trine, to see how that's sort of sweetened and probably also complicated. And then, because I would consider that to probably be part of this departure from her family, because it's almost
Hmm.
a separate signature. And then also to, I would be so curious to know if Ellie's kid likes art. That would be one of my other questions.
Yeah, that having the ruler of the ascendant in the seventh whole sign house is definitely directing the life or showing a major focus on relationships. And then the other sort of gravity, where a lot of the gravity of the charts being focused on is also towards the 11th house here with that stellium in the 11th whole sign house. But that's the opposite end that maybe we'll have to do a follow-up episode on someday. It's just the fact that all those planets are also co-present with the MC. So we got that Libra stellium is in the 11th house and getting 11th house friends, groups, alliances, signification, but also with the MC there, it's getting career significations at the same time.
Yeah, I feel like professional artists are such a specific element of the population, and that if you grew up with multiple, let alone in, I feel like the UK, where it's probably, I mean, class is involved often as well. And I feel like if you choose to divert from that, there's a lot going into that decision, and I feel like a lot of that comes probably from that 11th house stellium.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. All right.
So we
So
Yeah, we do have a icy ruler in the seventh that sort of piggybacks on this, but it's a different sign. So we have Ebru, which is an Aquarius icy.
there we go. So this is
Cool.
a Libra rising chart with the IC in Aquarius.
Yeah, and then we have Saturn in Aries in the seventh, co-present with a Venus too, and with the Sun. So this is another one where we have the icy ruler and midheaven ruler together, which is often part of a conversation. Oh, yeah, that and the ascendant ruler as well, being Venus, of course. And so, okay, so Ebru shares. Mm, Love is a very important concept in my family. My mother and father were very much in love, and my mother got pregnant and they had to get married. They separated, although very much in love, and got married again when I was 7, separated again 3 years later. My grandmother was very much in love with a married man, and they had an on and off relationship for 40 years. My grandmother, my mother, and me, we all had off marriage pregnancies at a very early age. Also, creativity is an important part of my home. I grew up in a home with lots of literature and poem reading. I never had children. My partner is now a sculptor and I paint at home too. So we have many artworks at home. I feel like that really wraps up the seventh house, fifth house significations quite astutely.
Yeah, that's incredible. I love that they brought up the concept of love just because that was a major one that came out during the course of the Fifth House series. And we actually, I think, culminated some of maybe it was our Ruler of the Ascendant episode talking about bell hooks books where in like the later there was different like eras in bell hook's career, but it seemed like in the later phases of bell hook's career she really was like focused on the concept of love as this like transformative element that had to be reconceptualized, but once it was reconceptualized it could be a positive like counteracting influence for communities and for the world in a very significant way. And that there was a whole fifth house stellium or a fifth house emphasis that was driving a lot of that, is what we saw.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, all about love. Yeah, there's um, I mean, the fifth house as the joy of Venus is very, very loud in a lot of these IC examples. So it's funny when you're working with third house ICs, working with that joy of the moon idea, and then with fifth house ICs working with that joy of Venus, it really brings out some really stunning things that you might not necessarily notice otherwise until you're talking with someone and asking these questions. And this is often what comes out. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But
Uh,
it's interesting how in both instances it was like the theme or the topic of love was like a major factor in terms of the parents and bringing them together at different points, and then also with the grandparents in this instance as well.
Yeah, and then of course, because the seventh house planets, so this icy ruler, midheaven ruler, ascendant ruler, are all ruled by that Mars in the third as well. And so we see a little bit of that coming in too in terms of these generational patterns of grandparents and extended family um and those being presences in the fifth house stories.
Right. And
Feels really
also
potent.
it's like this is so the IC is in Aquarius in the fifth whole sign, so it's ruled by Saturn in the seventh, but it's also Saturn in a night chart, so it's a more challenging placement, and so sometimes there were, the parents there were challenges with the marriage and the
Mhm.
marriage they moved away from it at different points, but then also it's conjunct Venus in a night chart, which is the most positive planet, so you're getting extremes of some of the greatest challenges and then some of the most positive things. And the parents early in the life, part of the experience of that was the parents playing out that dynamic of this dynamic of attraction and being brought together by love and then being pushed apart as well at different points with Saturn.
And this brings in a little bit of that moon too, but she also shares that um, since I changed homes so many times, so we see that in the fourth house, fifth house piece of it. I see divorced two marriages. I fell in love so many times. I feel like that's
Mm,
such a seventh house stellium ruling the IC, just being so foundational to one's life. I bought my house with so many challenges and then had a legal battle with my second house husband about the house. So here we're seeing, I think, the Saturn in fall too aspect of it, um,
right.
on top of the night chartness of it, and the eighth house as well. But all ruling that IC and just able to articulate it and being so prominent to her identity in life.
Yeah, that's really good. The ruler of the fourth and the ruler of the IC and the seventh as Saturn in a night chart and having a separation, a divorce from a partner where there's a dispute over the home, basically, in the living situation.
Oh, and I just saw she's also born on Venus Day and hour too.
Mm, nice,
That's
nice.
really sweet.
All right.
Okay, so
Anything else?
the other Aquarius example that we have is AN, and this one's really quick, but I think we should look at it because it's so astrologer good.
There we go.
So this is AN, also an Aquarius IC with Libra rising, and this is Saturn in Cancer in the 10th house. Versus, of course, the midheaven has Mars and Leo on it in the 11th. So, and they share. My father is an accomplished obstetrician who delivered thousands of babies. Many of the babies were of famous lineage, like babies of famous people or sports heroes, etc. Um, it's like you see the 10th house angularity, I feel like, come on so strongly as the ruler of the IC. But then she also shares, but that her immediate family was broken apart by a romantic affair, and it's been very hard at times also.
Right. Yeah, that was a major theme that came up with the fifth house is not just babies, but also sometimes, and not just love, but also romantic affairs and that other side of the fifth house, which is like on the one hand, like physical passion, and that is a driving factor, as well as sometimes the overlapping things of people falling in love with different people and that creating ambiguity and sometimes taking them, pulling them in different directions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the fifth house, there was I mean, in this sort of negation or absence, like the fifth house contains a lot of like difficult experiences too, right? Like fertility
Hmm.
challenges, which we don't have any examples with that, but we're in a few of the examples, of course. And we already heard with like miscarriage and stillbirth being that was the third house example, but we see so much of that when we talk about fifth house stories, especially when they're difficult. Um, yeah, and
Absolutely.
also connections between that sort of pleasure, joy, partying lifestyle, which can spiral into addiction, right? And when we're dealing with the IC, especially if it's with hard planets or ruled by planets in difficult positions as well, like that stuff gets inherited, and people are carry lineages and trauma around that, even if they weren't necessarily impacted directly. It can impact people for generations and generations. And I think when you have a fifth house IC, that is something that can come up for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love the core of this example, though. The father helped
Hmm.
to deliver babies with the IC, the father in the fifth house of children. And then they were often like famous babies or coming from famous families with the ruler of the fifth house and IC in the 10th whole sign house of career and the
Yeah.
public and reputation.
Yeah. And with that, the moon Jupiter in the sixth, which I'm sure has many expressions for this person, but as one of them being in charge of that Saturn, having like a little bit of the bonifying support of it so that it's not. It's not just, there's you can see that Saturn in Cancer and why it's got more juice than you might think otherwise.
Yeah. All right.
I love that.
Definitely.
I think we should pull up Karina, who's our Gemini IC example.
Here we go.
This is just a very sweet, beautiful one that pulls on the children association.
So this is Aquarius rising with the IC and Gemini in the fifth whole sign house.
And so Karina's IC ruler is Mercury in Aquarius, right with the ascendant. It's retrograde, but it feels very potent to me. So Karina shares, I grew up as a multiracial Yoruba Nigerian in diaspora. Both my sister and me have the same IC, have the IC in the fifth whole sign house, and we have both relied heavily on our artistic practices to connect with our Nigerian heritage. She is a visual artist and graphic novelist, and I'm a writer. Since I was a teenager, I've used fiction and poetry writing as an opportunity to imagine the familial ancestry and stories that I'm disconnected from and to feel a sense of connection with my roots. So here we have the writer artist aspect of a fifth house IC, literally using writing to connect with roots, and with the ruler being Mercury on the ascendant. And then they also share, I am also one of those people who has been dreaming up names for my future children since I was a child myself. So by now I have dozens of baby names compiled to draw upon when I do have a kid. Not only is this a super Yoruba thing, brackets, it's common for people to have 8 to 10 given names in our culture. Imagining my future children has always been grounding for me. The IC in the fifth feels like being grounded in imaginaries of the future.
I love that. That's beautiful.
Oh, so gorgeous. So
Yeah, this
gorgeous.
makes a lot of sense. This connected with one example I didn't bring over into this because I'd already used it twice in the fourth and fifth house episodes, I think. But there was a listener and patron named Ola Bempe who had the IC in the fifth house, I believe. And also, there were things about her father and her family lineage and place of origin that were she was incorporating into her creative output. And that was like a really important thing in her life. So I love this example because this sort of complements that one as well and it reminds me of it.
I love that. Yeah, it's so spot on. Hmm. I
Yeah,
think
so the family the family and family roots and origins sometimes inspiring one's creative output or provides a nice archetypal parallel with like the Billie Jean example where it was like a supportive athletic family that was supporting the natives' pursuit of sports in a joyful and positive way. And they're even though those are completely different in terms of the focus of sports versus art, you can see we're starting to get to understand the code underlying that placement a little bit and how there can be an archetypal similarity there.
yeah, yeah. Super spot on. I love the um thinking about like the fourth house south node too. And I mean that and the Venus with Jupiter with the midheaven, right? And so it's like even this absence and this disconnection that they feel related to fourth house topics ends up fueling like the art and the writing that they do. It feels and contributes to their own sense of identity. And that feels like a way that I see in the fifth can also describe like a dislocation from fourth house topics in a more expected kind of conventional way.
Yeah. All
I
right.
love that.
So
Yeah.
what else do we
Uh,
got?
yeah, so we have another one that speaks to um the fifth house home, bringing in like the fourth house topics into the fifth house. So we'll pull up Elodie, who is our Pisces IC example here.
I had an issue, I don't finding the location for this chart so that
Oh, oh,
we might
yes,
have to
yes.
describe it
Okay, I'll
because
just describe it.
Solar Fire's not doing me any
Yeah,
favors. Although if the ice, I could just animate it and
it's sure.
like roughly recreate the chart, even if I don't have it exactly right.
Yeah, Quebec place names. As a Canadian myself, I've had to wrangle with Quebec place names often in my
Okay, so
practice.
shout out. I know Elodie. Shout out to Elodie. Apology to Elodie. Elodie. I know Elodie is an astrologer, and yeah, but so we don't. This is not going to be exact, but it's a Scorpio rising
But yeah.
chart with the IC and Pisces in the fifth whole sign house.
And this is Jupiter in Virgo example two with Jupiter with the midheaven in the 11th as well. And so Elodie shares, I have a Pisces IC in the fifth house, and I grew up in a house filled with music. My dad as a musician and a luthier. And so I had to look that up actually, but it's someone who restrings and actually crafts musical instruments. He is also a Pisces sun, Venus, Mercury. So we have the father association with the IC. Both my grandparents on my maternal side have strong Pisces signatures. My mom is a midwife, and I grew up very closely with the world of pregnancy and babies. My mom delivered my three younger brothers at home. That is such a
Wow.
spot on. There's some other examples with people growing up with daycares with fifth house
Mm.
IC. And Elodie also shares, I was brought up Baha'i, which has a lot to do with the universality of mankind and the acceptance of all religion as basis for peace in the world, which is so ruler of the IC and Pisces in the fifth, in the 11th with the midheaven. I always made a lot of art at home growing up, and my first job was being a singer and songwriter. I lived near the ocean growing up next to the St. Lawrence River. If you know, you know. I do know. It's basically living beside the ocean. The St. Lawrence River is huge. Even though I moved a lot and even though I moved a lot and ended up living on the island of Newfoundland for the past 20 years, surrounded by water, very Piscean reality living here in the fog. I think this is such a beautiful like Pisces I see kind of Jupiter in the 11th, like going and exploring and then kind of coming home to your sort of the primordial soup of where your IC is. I feel like happens to a lot of people. And so this
Mm.
Pisces IC being born next to the river and then leaving it and then coming back to the ocean feels really, really spot on too.
Nice. I like that.
She shares, I've always felt that my Pisces IC is who I am deep inside. I usually look at the IC to gauge where people's roots are planted, and mine are planted in the elusive spiritual waters of Pisces.
Beautiful. I love that.
This is just gorgeous. I feel like also this is an interesting thing about how, earlier in life she was an artist, like a singer-songwriter. And I mean, I still think of Elodie as an artist, but that um that sort of distinct phases of life. And I mean, there's all kinds of ways, like triplicity ways, et cetera, to look at this. But I think there's with fifth house ICs, like depending on what's happening with the midheaven and the midheaven rulers, people don't always bring those formative artistic experiences with them into their adult life, right? And sometimes
Mm.
it's really important when people are working with their IC and just working with their chart in order to recover some of that. And sometimes it's just it stays back there, it just stays, but like recognizing the foundations and like how important those third house, those fifth house experiences were, um, and still are to like foundation and grounding is a beautiful thing that looking at the IC can give to people, even if those topics aren't as relevant in their adult lives.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned basically the 11th house component with the ruler of the fifth slash IC in the 11th house and Elodie talking about growing up in the Baha'i faith and emphasizing that it was a big community of people that came together to pray and celebrate. And so there was this major like community element to things.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know a lot about the Baha'i faith, but I know enough to know it's quite a global phenomenon, right? And
Mm.
that it really not only in the way that what did phrase did Elodie use? One planet, one people, right? Which
Mm.
is so 11th house in terms of that. Um, yeah, just considering humanity, right? And the kind of ideology that underpins that, which does feel quite Virgoan and very, very Jupiterian.
Mm. Right, definitely. Brilliant. All right, that's a
Mhm.
great example. Shout out to Elodie for submitting that.
Yeah, so because you shared a Taurus example, I think I'm only going to share one of the Taurus examples, and this will be our last one.
Actually, one last
Oh,
thing. One thing
yeah,
that
sure.
Elodie's chart reminded me of just a thing that was mentioned in passing, was how she mentioned parent having placements in like early Pisces, right?
Hmm.
So that's a really important element here. And I did a short
Yeah,
video about that a month or two ago, because that's another element that we can't see. We literally can't see from just the birth chart itself. And yet it plays a crucial role in sometimes determining how one chart that has, like, let's say, the IC in the fifth house, let's say it's almost the exact same placement, like the same degrees, you'll have one person that was born in a hospital on that day, born into a family where they have like their mother has a Venus Jupiter conjunction on the degree of the IC in the fifth whole sign house. And then you'll have another person born that has the same degree of the IC in the fifth whole sign house, but their mother has, like, let's say, like a Mars, Saturn, Pluto conjunction or something on the degree of the IC in the fifth whole sign house. And therefore, from our limited vantage point, unfortunately, as astrologers, if we just look at the birth chart, we can only see we see a similarity on the surface level there between those two placements of the potentiality of pointing us in IC/fifth house direction, of that being an important area of the life. But the person's experience may be wildly different based on the synastry they have with their parents' birth chart, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
absolutely. 100%. Yeah, and I think we'll mention this briefly at the end, but my upcoming talk at UAC is actually called The IC in Relationship. And it's about more than just that kind of familial relationship, but we will be in part looking at that because it does, I mean, it's our environment, right? And it's, of course, it's not just our familial environment, it's also the land where we grew up. It's everything environmental that contributes to that IC. But when it comes to the number of connections you can trace through whether, and even just whether or not the IC sign shows up in a family, like it often does, as being quite important, but then sometimes it doesn't, right? And the IC is actually this strange kind of oddball zodiacally in an intermediate family unit. And that says something as well. Like that says part of the story about how this person might feel displaced from their immediate family and how that contributes to their ideas of basically everything, but especially themselves and what's possible when it comes to that kind of connection.
Right.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's a really good point. But that, and it also brings in an element of, while we talked earlier about how the placement in the natal chart could be receiving affirming aspects from the benefics or negating aspects from the malefics that are saying yes or no to those topics, the synastry will functionally do the same thing, where if you
Mhm.
have, positive synastry from a parent or a family member that's supporting that placement, it may affirm it in a good way. But if there's challenging things, it could be negating it. And our challenge as astrologers, unfortunately, is our viewpoint sometimes is limited in terms of like not being able to take into account like all charts at all times and everything else. So, but it's an important element when researching this topic, that can be like an X factor that can send a wild card that um, that is sometimes hard to account for. But sometimes when you're living it, like if you are, for example, Elodie in that case, like she knows what parent has stuff in early Pisces and how that's contributing to things. But as a consulting astrologer, sometimes it's a little tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Love the question asking. I say in the book, actually, I say like the IC is a place of questions because it's you basically have to ask questions in order to be able to tell what's going on there. That's why I think so many of the survey responses, and I think it's partially a testament to, I mean, not only the work my audience has done in working with the IC and putting their delineations, their self delineations together, but also like what you've been doing on the podcast in terms of also showing this like more nuanced method of delineating it and delineating the houses. And I think, yeah, there's the examples just really speak to the whole breadth of human experience while also displaying the method and the technique just so starkly and so beautifully. I'm really, yeah, I'm really happy to have had the opportunity to do that survey.
Yeah, this has been amazing. This is amazing. And I'll be looking forward to your lecture at the United Astrology Conference next year on this. So that'll be great. A great topic. All
So
right. Do we have any more
I have
fifth house
one last
examples?
example.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is a Taurus example, and it's another fifth house. And this one is one that really blends things, but I think speaks and sums up really nicely what we've been talking about in terms of negation and experiences of that and departure from things that we've inherited as well.
So
So this
which
is
one is this?
this is Miri, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Capriizing and Taurus IC,
Yeah,
got it.
that's perfect. Okay,
There we
so
go.
Miri shares. I'm just going to read Miri's because it's very well written. My IC is in the fifth house of Taurus, ruled by exalted Venus and Pisces in the third. Firstly, I come from a lineage of artists and musicians. My family members are college artists, painters, watercolorists, and sculptors, many of whom also sing and play the guitar, lute, bass, piano, drums, and so on. Our ancestors used to work in the Royal London Orchestra. I spent my whole childhood painting and drawing or helping my mother teaching her art classes. Secondly, many of them earn their money by working with children as art teachers. Thirdly, our family home is filled with artworks and located in the beautiful English countryside next to a nature reserve. My family carry out their own preservation of local animal and plant species on our land, which includes gardens, meadows filled with all kinds of wildflowers, fruit trees, bushes, and vegetable patches. You will find all kinds of endangered birds taking sanctuary there, so the house is surrounded by bird song. You will also see deer, pheasants, bees, and foxes. A lot of my family's artwork is inspired by the surrounding nature and animals.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so that Taurus IC ruled by that exalted Venus in the
Yeah,
third with the Sun and Saturn.
yeah, which is and Venus is like closely sextiling the IC.
Yeah. Yeah. And then with this moon and cap in the first feels relevant too. I really do look at the domicile ruler and the exaltation ruler of the IC whenever I look at a chart. And then you can look at all kinds of rulers of the IC, of course, but there really is when there's sort of sympathy in between them, they speak to um there's different flavors of the experience of the IC in different ways. So she shares the ruler of my IC is placed in the third. All my immediate family are all art teachers involved in education. They spend a lot of time talking about the neighbors in the village. I think gossip is an underrated third house
Hmm,
signification, even though it's also 11th, but when it's
right?
local, it's so third house. Um, Furthermore, I lived with a lot of extended family and numerous siblings in the same house growing up, with my grandparents, uncles, and brother on my mom's side, and with my stepmother, stepsisters, and half sisters on my dad's side. Um, and then we also have um, languages in terms of an older third cousin also lived with them who could speak fluent Chinese after marrying someone. And this was so inspiring to Miri as a child that she did a school trip to China and then ended up studying Chinese at university and moving to China.
Wow, that's brilliant.
Hmm. Yeah, and then Um, this is when it comes to, and so we have that third house emphasis of the education, literally art teachers, right? Fifth house, the art, and then the third house, we're in the teachers. And then we also, of course, opposite that is the Virgo, which is the ninth, which is what we might associate with teaching more generally. And then that having a connection with Mercury, Mars in the second in Aquarius, that Mars in a tight square to the midheaven IC, which is part of what we talked about before. And then the south node on the IC as well. And so in the final part, she mentions, my experience of the IC was not so great. And this is despite it being seemingly idyllic, right? Um, presence with the South Node in opposition with Pluto, and then the square to Mars, I think, is also very prominent. The ruler of the IC is co-present with Saturn in a night chart. So there was a lot of struggles, feeling very isolated in the rural home I grew up in, away from society, and there was a dark and dirty side to the countryside life. Many of my extended relatives were abusive, causing significant trauma to me, and there was never escape from such a large family. These conditions are what partially pushed me to abandon the pursuit of art myself and move across to the other side of the world as an adult,
Okay. Yeah.
right?
I was the other because I was wondering what the other side of the third house was because even though it's the fifth and the IC is ruled by this exalted Venus in a night chart, which is the best planet in the chart, like the third house also has Saturn in a night chart, which is the most challenging planet in the chart, just
Yeah.
based on sect. And I thought there might have been a bit of that with the implication of like the gossiping component, but that's where that comes out more.
Yeah, it's really spot on to be able to have that, what seems idyllic, right? And what seems like kind of a perfect, pristine childhood and, an exalted ruler of your IC is definitely going to offer some of that. But then to have it be a lot of like other people's experience, right? And to have it not be like so much of your own experience too. And I think that there's um, the South Node with the IC and this Mars square and literally leaving that place and going and making her own way, literally halfway across the world feels so with Mercury, who rules that ninth house, right? It just feels
Yeah.
very, very potent.
Yeah, well, and it's a comment I get constantly on YouTube, which is just like, well, what happens if the most positive planet based on sect and the most challenging planet based on sect are in the same house? And the
Mm.
answer is like, you get both. You get
Yeah,
extremes of some of the best stuff and then extremes of some of the most challenging stuff in the same area or the same sector of the life.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Always.
Nice.
Yeah.
Always. Yeah. Yeah, that's brilliant though. That's such a vivid example. Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah, I feel like it really sums up kind of a lot of what we're talking about here in terms of being able to see the differentiations between the houses and where the IC lands versus the houses where um, it's associated with. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Is that our last? We're gonna end on a high note. Is there
Yeah.
any final ones?
Well, I mean,
I
there is
mean,
one that I pulled out
I'm fine.
that
I
it,
wasn't saying we have to. I know, but I was gonna leave it up to you.
Well, I feel like it was someone finding their way toward astrology and making meaning of such an experience feels pretty potent. There is one other one that I was thinking of sharing, and when I was going through the signs, when I was going through the submissions, I was really looking for um, chart rulers. Not that we were going to include chart rulers in every one of the houses, but I like
Hmm.
that as a sort of sample spread. And I had a hell of a time finding a IC ruler in the fourth whole sign house for this. So I
Mm.
did find one, but as I mentioned before, it's someone who doesn't necessarily like appreciate kind of what we're doing. So I wonder if we want to look at it because I feel like um, it kind of like opens up what we're talking about in terms of negation. So this is LJ. So it's another Taurus example, but it is the last one that I pulled out because I thought it would be an interesting way to end.
Okay, so this is Capricorn rising with the IC and Taurus in the fifth whole sign house.
Yeah, so she doesn't give us very much, so we don't have a lot to work with, but I think we can maybe pull apart a bit around why it doesn't track, and maybe point to, so if some other people, even after all this, are like, I still don't get it, we might be able to point to some little pieces to pull out what might make it click. So LJ shares. So LJ's IC is in Taurus in the fifth house, the same as this last one we looked at, and their IC ruler is Venus in Aries in the fourth house. So this is a fourth house IC ruler, and so LJ shares, I find it a bit confusing because when it comes to home, I don't have children, so I don't have those familial stories in my life as much as I once wanted children. That ship has now sailed. I feel like how protective I am over my home and my roots feels more Aries than Taurus. I also didn't have a particularly supportive family when it came to my art practice, and pleasure certainly isn't something that figures into my family life. So I suppose I don't see how the IC relates to me. Venus would rule my fifth house, but she's in my fourth house in Aries, though I'm incredibly lost as to how that's related. Like I said above, I feel like my IC would make more sense in the fourth, and having it in the fifth just makes me wonder what the IC is even for.
Okay.
Which is like, okay, so what we did get from this is that LJ does have an art practice that her family was not supportive of. So that's kind of the main thing that feels connective to me. So we do have this fourth house experience of immediate family, right? Those kind of origin stories that are present, potentially a father. The Mars is down there with Venus, right? Um, but then we have this fifth house IC. And then one thing that I do like doing is when we're thinking about an IC, if it does have an exaltation ruler, if the domicile ruler is in a situation like this, where Venus is in aversion to the IC, right? And also in a tricky position, despite being, powerful in a night chart, we can sometimes, if it does, look to the exaltation ruler, right? And so she does have this very waning Pisces moon in third with Mercury. And so my question to LJ would be if the fourth house stuff is too hot and too spiky and not supportive to fifth house icy topics, right? It's like, what about the third house? What does it offer it, right? And what does thinking about the Taurusness of it, right? Like thinking with the zodiacal sign and the ecology and the mythology and everything we know about the signs. It's like, how does that contribute? Because protective of home there is definitely a Marsy Aries way to go about doing that, but there is also a Tauran way, I think. And I'm curious if like allowing allowing what would arise by taking seriously Taurus as your IC, right? And allowing that to be separate from these harmful familial uh, involvements, even though, of course, we see that with the IC ruler being in the fourth. There seems to me to be a conversation that can happen there um, that isn't necessarily about those experiences, although it obviously has been formed by them. And I feel like that's part of what I see in this chart in terms of what she shared.
Okay. In the document, I think I'm missing one of the paragraphs. I don't know if it accidentally got deleted. Is it just this paragraph, or are we missing one?
Um,
There
there.
it
I don't
is.
know what
Okay.
happened. Yeah. So no children. So
One,
expanding this fifth house piece of it.
yeah, I mean the thing for me is I just think it's more of a classic instance of the negation because it just has to do with
Yeah.
like I don't use exaltation rulers, so I can't speak to that, but I do think that that Saturn placement in a night chart, which is the more challenging planet in the chart as a result of it being a night chart, is opposing the IC and opposing the fifth house. And so what we're getting is Saturn negating some of those fifth house and IC topics. And that's why may be less of a ability to relate to some of that stuff. For example, with the topic of children.
Yeah, and being the ascendant ruler.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that being so much more present in her
Well,
experience.
right. And then when it's the ascendant ruler, sometimes it's like that stuff is arising as a result of choice and personal volition. So it's like um,
Mm-hmm.
potentially a choice not to have children on some level, or that arising um, as a result of,
Mm-hmm.
in some instances, certain choices that the person makes.
Yeah, or having wanted to, and then the life just like not making space for it.
Right, right, exactly. Right, okay, because she says that that was something that she did want at one point in time, but that that ship has sailed. So I don't know if that's it's hard
Mm.
to like infer things. I don't know if that's implying some wistfulness over that or what necessarily.
Yeah, I mean that Mars is so powerful too, right? And this is another thing is that when we're thinking about um, this kind of lively uh, planets as people, kind of, and like seeing how they actually show up in our day-to-day life and in our worlds. And it's like sometimes the planets are just like much, much louder than other planets, right? And so the Venus of that experience and the Venus and Aries of that experience, even though she's separating from Mars at the same time, the presence of that Mars in the fourth house would probably drown out whatever Venus is trying to sing.
Yeah. Yeah, and this it really is just going back to what we were talking about earlier. So we almost this would have been good to pull out at that point because of the negation idea of that sometimes astrologers run into an issue of not understanding a placement when it's like not being able to relate to a placement, but it's arising out of the negation. So it's like the two things we know about this person is that the topic of children was negated for some reason with Saturn opposing the
Mm.
fifth, and that the parents were not supportive of the creative pursuits with Saturn opposing the IC in the fifth. So the reason the native doesn't resonate with it is because they're expecting an affirmation of those things, but the chart aspects, at least, the only aspects to that IC of major aspects were not ones that were lending as much support as they potentially could have.
Hmm.
Okay, interesting. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I
that
think
is
I think that tracks. I hope that's clarifying for LJ.
yeah, because the other part of it is it's not just setting up because Rhetorius talks about this in the second house of when a planet is like aspecting through especially like an opposition and that one of the paradigms in Hellenistic astrology is that planets can aspect empty houses. You don't have to have a planet in a house in order for a planet to aspect that house, partially because even if a house is empty, like it kind of is in this instance, at least in terms of planets with Taurus in the fifth whole sign house with the IC, we do know that at some point at different points in the life, planets will transit through Taurus. But then it's like, what is the experience once planets, let's say, especially slow moving ones or retrogrades, move into Taurus? Part of their experience is that they immediately activate that opposition with Saturn in Scorpio in a night chart. So, for example, the Saturn opposition as a teenager would have been experienced as Saturn going through the fifth house and activating that natal Saturn placement. And it probably at that point as a teenager was experienced as the parents not being supportive of the natives' like creative aspirations or pursuits.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, those oppositions are definitely real. And of course, like the midheaven is treated as powerful for many good reasons, right? This is a huge part of why the IC is also hard to talk about. And especially when we have planets with the midheaven, whether they're angle ruler or not, they tend to be a lot like they pull focus, right, away from the IC. And so this is a function of that negation. But then when you're in a consultation with someone, and they want to relate with their IC, right? And they want to make sense of it in a kind of more life-giving way, even when it's in a hard situation like this. It often takes like giving those mid planets with the midheaven space and being able to be like, okay, like here you are. This is what you're saying. We hear you. How about you like we're how about we make some space in order to tend to these roots, even if they're hard, um, even if it feels sort of impossible because of other things that are going on in the chart. And I think it is possible, but the midheaven is incredible as a point in the chart and as a point in people's lives. And I really feel that um, that mycelial understanding of the IC as part of what nourishes our midheaven and nourishes those expressions. Um, and you do see that when there's planets with the midheaven and the IC is in an otherwise empty house for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. The final thing here is just is the implication that the native, they said the parents did not support my art practice. Is the implication then that the native still became an artist or does have a did continue their art practice despite their family's like opposition to it?
So they don't say here, but I would kind of think so, just looking at the chart, but it doesn't say. And so
Okay.
that would be one of my follow-up questions with this chart for sure. Because especially with that third house emphasis too, like that, I mean, there's there's writerliness, you know what I mean? So I think that it would be very interesting to know if this person did continue to have an art practice in their own way, despite that parent's negation of it, for sure.
R- Right, for sure. Yeah, and then that's really what it would become. And then ruler of the fifth, Venus in the fourth, also ruling the 10th. And yeah, just the potential that they did, although Venus is also opposing Pluto. So there you get some of the tensions with like the family potentially not supporting the art practice, but the natives still gravitating towards artistic pursuits. So you end up with a very complex delineation there then that provides a nice counterpoint to some of our other delineations where the parents were supportive of the natives' creative pursuits of just like asking a person like how would you describe a chart where a person didn't receive support from their family for their creative pursuits but nonetheless continue to pursue that anyways, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's spot
Cool.
on. I guess
Yeah.
that's also not a high note, but the IC kind of isn't like that often.
Yeah, well, it does help to fill out the picture for us so that we've seen a full spectrum of like lots of different experiences and of the entire spectrum. And that's really what's important for us as astrologers. And it's like it's what I like when that's one of the reasons I do these long episodes with like lots of chart examples because I want to not just show one or two or three chart examples and go really deep into those and then call it a day. I want people to see the full spectrum. And I think this was really brilliant research, and I'm really glad that we did this. And I'm glad you put together that survey and then helped and went through all of these to pick out some of the best ones because yeah, I think we got a really good picture here, even though it's not like complete. It's not obviously there's more that could be said, but this is amazing. And I really appreciate, especially everyone that sent in their examples and wrote out and shared these life stories and their charts. So thank you to everybody who sent this in, as well as to you for doing this research and everything. This is really, really good.
Mm. I've been the IC in the third and the fifth has been a bit of a pet. I made sure when we did the IC book and the case stories there that there was at least a few ICs in the third as well as ICs in the fifth whole sign house, although it is majority IC in the fourth whole sign house. And I just, especially with the people who tend to be in my clients, I see a lot of people who do practice magic, they're spiritually inclined, and there's so much third house stuff that goes into that. And then, of course, being part of the queer community and the fifth house being such an important place in terms of those lineage ancestors that are outside of the bio family. And I just there's stories that need to be told, right? And so I really appreciate your willingness to uh, collab on the survey with me, and of course to everyone who wrote in because they're just such beautiful stories.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so excited to have done this finally because it's something I've meant to do for years, but I didn't feel like it was time and I was finally ready. And then I was actually thinking about reaching out to you for like several days. And then you emailed me like at the same time after I was on the verge of emailing you. So the synchronicity was perfect. And yeah, people should check out your book because you have a big, thick book on the IC and the meaning of the IC, and it's a really brilliant book. There it is.
I was
That
using
people.
it as my mouse pad.
Okay, nice. Yeah, but people can learn more about this topic and go deeper if they want to with your book on the subject.
Yeah, it is a labor of love. I really think of the book as a community project being backed on Kickstarter. And before that, it was supported through my Patreon. And, I started writing the book in 2018. So it's been a long time coming, and so many people were involved. And I'm just, yeah, grateful it's out there and grateful it exists as a resource for people for this very important but often underattended to point. So grateful to you for tending to it.
Yeah, I'm so glad we got to do this and got to fill out this missing technical piece that's always been so important to me in chart readings and that I developed and have followed over the past 20 years and have expressed the concept that I've always told people when I lecture on whole sign houses, even in a basic talk, that the IC imports fourth house significations into whatever whole sign house it falls. And I hope now it's clear what that means tangibly and why it is that I say that.
100%. No, I think this will be a very excited for this. Yeah, because we first talked about this a year ago, but then the book was sold out and we couldn't do it. And now it's available. But even I was going through my own grief processes for the last few months, which are IC related in part. And so I had to wait in order to even like follow back up with you about doing it. And so I love that the timing was full of synchronicity because it is definitely a spirit guided endeavor. And this just proves it yet again.
Absolutely, absolutely. Brilliant. All right. So you do consultations related to the IC and related to this material, and you have the book, which is available through your website, and you also have those lectures coming up, right?
Yeah, I'm speaking at NORWAC and UAC this year, which will be, both of them will be so lovely. UAC will be, we first met at UAC 2018. I don't know if you remember that. It was just in passing. I was
Hmm.
thanking, you were with Lisa, and I was thanking Lisa, because my first astrology conference I ever went to was NORWAC in 2016, and it was through an AFAN scholarship. And so I was thanking Lisa for her work with AFAN. And yeah, UAC 2026 in Chicago. I'm giving a talk on it's the IC and relationship one. And I'm actually doing some consultations opening this month, which is November for anyone watching later, and that are related to that topic. And so that if anyone's super interested in that aspect, they can get in on those. And then at NORWAC, I'm giving a talk, two lectures. So one on called The Mage and the Sage on Jupiter, Mercury, and taking kind of an experiential storytelling approach to how those planets relate in a chart. So we'll be looking at them using techniques and then kind of expanding it into what kind of stories they tell us. And then one on the IC, which will be more of a beginner intermediate kind of cozy uh, introduction to it, which will also be it'll be really sweet. Yeah, less technical than we did today, the one at NORWAC, but it'll be a really lovely time. And of course, that's virtual as well as in Seattle as well.
Nice. I love that. What's the URL again for both of your websites?
So my work consultations you can find at idola or at nineofwands.com, all spelled out. And that's also my Patreon gets early access. So if you're on my Patreon, you will get the heads up and my mailing list as well, which you can find on my website. And then the book is in the shop at idolastellarum.com.
Okay. And you don't have the book on Amazon currently. People need to get it from your website.
Yeah, yeah, they order it directly from us, both print and ebook.
Good. Okay, good. Just want to make sure that's clear. And the last thing is like 2018 keeps coming up, and I know I keep thinking every time you mention 2018 that how Uranus first went into Taurus at that time. And in the forecast, I just talked about how Uranus is returning back to Taurus for the final time for one last final lesson or to bring full circle all of the lessons that first started back in 2018. So I think it's brilliant that one, you started working on the IC work in 2018, and two, that we met in 2018, and now things are full circle, and we're doing a podcast on the IC at the end of that transit. I know we're not going into your chart, but I don't know if there's any way that that relates, but I'm very curious how that might relate to your chart or your journey in general.
Well, the lead up to me writing the book was actually Chiron. of all
Okay.
things. I had a, in Venus retrograde, I had a 5 pass Chiron transit to my IC, which
Uh,
resulted in a quite long period of homelessness and transience.
mm,
That both contributed to the writing of the IC and also interrupted it from time to time. And so that's the move into Aries coincided with Uranus's move into Taurus. And so there was like Uranus moving out of my fifth was also Chiron moving into my fifth. And so there's a piece there. But the IC my IC is in Pisces, and the Kickstarter was funded with the IC conjunction Venus, and it was Venus and Jupiter and Pisces in that chart. And then the IC was finally released um, publicly when Jupiter was in Gemini. So it was a
mm.
full my IC ruler moving from um, going going around.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I love, and then of course that was all activated last month. If your IC's in Pisces, just there was the Pisces
Hmm.
eclipse that just happened in September, and
Yeah.
Saturn just returned back to Pisces for its final thing, and it's going to station there this month because that's all. We're also getting the last final full circle of the past 3 years since March 2023 that Saturn's been going through Pisces. So that's also really beautiful.
Yeah, it's and my IC is third decan Pisces, so it is with Saturn. Yeah, it's fine. It's past officially, but it's, definitely still co-present in this last pass of it. Mm,
Nice. Cool.
yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for doing this.
Thank
Congratulations
you.
on the book. Everybody should get the book and check out your websites. And yeah, thanks very much for collaborating with me on this today.
Oh, it was great. It was good to work with you. It was fun. Yeah, thanks.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time. If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to find a way to help support my research, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to subscriber benefits such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, the monthly electional astrology podcast, an exclusive podcast series called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to patrons on my producers tier, including patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bazbaz, Kwatsi Alabarahu, Annie Newman, Ginger Sodlier, Berlin West, and Nikki Crawford. People often ask me if I'm available for consultations, but unfortunately I'm not right now because the podcast takes up so much of my time. However, I did create a consultations page on the Astrology Podcast website that has a list of astrologers that I recommend for astrological consultations. You can find that at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software we use here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is astrology software for the PC. You can get a 15% discount by using the promo code AP15 at the website alabe.com. For Mac users, I recommend the software AstroGold for Mac OS, which is astrology software for the Mac computer made by the creators of SolarFire for the PC. You can get a 15% discount with the promo code AstroPodcast15 through their website at astrogold.io. If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then I would recommend signing up for my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, plus monthly webinars and Q&A sessions, and then at the end of the course you get a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me if you pass the final written test. Find out more information at theastrologyschool.com. Finally, shout out to our sponsor for this episode, which is the United Astrology Conference, which is happening September 3rd through the 9th, 2026 in Chicago. Find out more information at uacastrology.com.